Welcome to Sleep for Stories. Thank you for joining us on this relaxing and mysterious journey. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future tales. Wishing you a peaceful listening experience and a restful sleep. It was a quiet evening, one of those where the air seemed thick with the stillness of the night. Henry sat in his small apartment, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, staring blankly at his phone. The glow of the screen illuminated his face in the dim light, casting shadows across the room. He had just returned from a long day at work, and all he wanted to do was relax. But as he scrolled through his messages, one particular notification caught his eye. It was from Sarah, a friend he hadn't spoken to in years. Her name popped up on his screen as if it was some sign, something he was meant to see. He hadn't heard from her since that fateful night when everything had changed. When Sarah moved away, they'd drifted apart. Azad moved away. They'd drifted apart. People often did. But the message was simple. Just 2 words. Call me. Henry's pulse quickened slightly. He hadn't even known if Sarah was still alive after all these years. Their last conversation had been cut short by an argument, one that had been forgotten by Sarah but burned in his memory. Still, a part of him couldn't ignore the pull of nostalgia, the strange connection that remained. He took a deep breath and pressed her contact. The phone rang once, twice, and just as he was about to hang up, someone picked up. Hello? The voice on the other end was unmistakable, even after all these years. It was Sarah's voice, but something about it felt off. It sounded distant, like she was in another room, or perhaps another world. Entirely, Sarah? Henry asked, his voice shaking just a bit. Is that really you? There was a long pause before she responded. Henry, it's so good to hear your voice again. He felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something odd about her tone, almost as if she wasn't fully there. I didn't expect to hear from you. What's going on? How have you been? Sarah laughed softly, but it didn't sound quite right. It was too sharp, too hollow. I've been fine, Henry. You know, just living. She paused, her voice lowering. I need your help with something. Henry's curiosity piqued, but a sense of unease settled in the pit of his stomach. Kind of help. You'll understand soon enough, Sarah replied cryptically. I just need you to meet me. I can't explain it over the phone. Meet you? Henry's brow furrowed. There was a long silence, and then Sarah's voice came through, quieter this time, as if she was standing farther away. You know, the old house on Maple Street. The one we used to pass on our walks. I'm there now. The hairs on the back of Henry's neck stood up. The house she was referring to had always been an oddity in their small town. It was abandoned, decrepit, with boarded-up windows and an overgrown yard. No one had lived there for 4 years, yet it had always felt wrong. The house seemed to have a life of its own, a history that was better left unexplored. I don't know, Sarah, it's late. And I don't think, please, she interrupted, her voice trembling, now more desperate. You have to come. I can't do this alone. Please, Henry. There was something in her voice, something so raw, so pleading, that Henry couldn't bring himself to refuse. His instincts told him to hang up, to turn away, up, and forget the entire conversation. But the old part of him, the one that had known Sarah so well, couldn't ignore her cry for help. All right, he said finally, swallowing his fear. I'll come, but this better not be some prank. You'll be waiting, she whispered, and the line went dead. Henry sat in stunned silence for a moment, the phone still pressed against his ear. The quiet of the apartment felt suffocating, the air thick with unease. He stared at the phone for a long time, as if waiting for Sarah to call back and tell him it was all a joke. But there was nothing. The silence was oppressive, thick with the weight of unanswered questions. He grabbed his jacket, his heart pounding in his chest, and left the apartment without another thought. The streets outside were empty, the quiet of the night settling around him like a heavy fog. As he walked toward Maple Street, the unease gnawed at him. It felt as though the world had shifted somehow, like he was walking into something he wasn't supposed to understand. The house on Maple Street appeared before him, just as it had always been. Dark, decaying, and abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the front yard wild with weeds. But tonight, there was something different about it. The air around the house felt heavier, as if the very ground it stood on was alive with energy. Henry hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the cold metal of the gate. He hadn't been here in years, but now that he was standing in front of it, the memories came flooding back, memories of laughter, of late-night talks with Sarah, of the friendship they once shared. But now, all of that felt distant, clouded by the unease that had settled in ease. His gut. He pushed open the gate and made his way up the cracked path. The closer he got to the door, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if the house itself was breathing, waiting for him. His pulse quickened, and his mind raced with thoughts of what Sarah had meant by, "You'll understand soon enough." He reached for the door, his hand trembling as it gripped the cold handle. The door creaked open on its own, a sharp, eerie sound that sent a chill down his spine inside. The house was even darker than he had imagined. The air smelled musty, old, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. His footsteps echoed in the silence as he walked into the foyer, the shadows stretching across the floor. The walls were mitre, covered in peeling wallpaper, and the furniture, if you could call it that, was a collection of decaying remnants. But there, in the center of the room, stood Sarah. She was standing near the staircase, her back to him. The room was cold, and her presence seemed almost unnatural, as if she didn't quite belong there. "Sarah?" Henry called out softly, his voice wavering. "You wanted to see me? You wanted to see me?" She turned slowly, and when she faced him, Henry's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes, they were not the eyes he remembered. They were wide, vacant, the pupils black voids that seemed to absorb the light around them. Her skin was that seemed to absorb the light around them. Her skin pale, almost translucent, and her mouth was twisted into an unnatural smile. But the most unsettling thing was the way she looked at him. It wasn't Sarah anymore. The person standing in front of him was something else entirely. I'm so glad you came, Henry," she said, her voice low and hollow, no longer familiar. "You were always so curious, always wanting to know more." Henry took a step back, his heart racing. "Sarah? What's happening to you?" Her smile widened, and she took a slow step toward him. "I'm not Sarah anymore, Henry. I'm something else, and now, so are you." Before he could react, the room seemed to shift, the walls closing in around him, the shadows lengthening. Felt a cold breath on his neck, the whisper of something ancient and malevolent brushing against his mind. And then he understood. Whatever Sarah had become was part of something far darker, something far older than he could comprehend. The darkness in the room grew thicker, the walls pulsing with an unholy energy, and the last thing Henry heard before everything went black was Sarah's voice, echoing in his mind. "You can never leave, Henry. You belong here now, Jason slowly. You belong here now." Jason slowly turned away from the door, feeling the weight of Sarah's eerie transformation pressing on him. The darkness in the room thickened, making it difficult to breathe. He instinctively stepped back, his mind racing. Was this really Sarah? Or had something else taken over her? Something dark and sinister. The sense of dread intensified with each passing second, and Jason knew he had to act quickly. before whatever she had become fully enveloped him as well. His feet moved involuntarily toward the staircase, the creaking of the floorboards beneath him a constant reminder of the fact that he wasn't alone in this cursed house. As his hand brushed against the banister, a strange coldness ran up his arm, as if the very wood was infused with the same malevolent force that had taken root in him. Sarah! He glanced back over his shoulder to see Sarah, or whatever she had become, still standing in the same spot, her vacant eyes fixed on him, unblinking. Her lips curled into a smile, one that felt wrong in every way. It wasn't a smile of joy or familiarity. It was a grin that seemed to promise something darker. "You can't escape," she whispered, the words barely audible, as though they were being pulled out of her against her will. The sound sent a chill through Jason's body. We're always meant to be here." Jason's heart raced as he bolted up the staircase. He didn't know what was happening, but the need to get away from her, from whatever this place had become, was overpowering. The stairs groaned under his weight. Each step amplifying the sense that something was right behind him, waiting for him to falter. He couldn't turn around to look, but he could feel the presence at his back closing in, stalking him, a breath away. As he reached the top of the stairs, Jason hesitated. He could hear her voice, softer now, almost as if it were being whispered into his mind rather than his ears. "You belong to us now, Henry." Jason froze, his blood running cold. The name Henry wasn't his yet. He recognized it. It was her voice. But why had she called him that? Shaking off the confusion, Jason stepped into the first room at the top of the stairs, a bedroom that smelled of decay and dust. The walls were lined with cracked mirrors, their reflective surfaces warped, distorting his own image. There was no time to think about it now. Jason's eyes scanned the room, looking for any way to escape this nightmare. The room's only window was covered by heavy curtains, the kind that felt too thick for such a small, decaying room. His heart pounded as he crossed the room, pulling the curtains aside with trembling hands. Outside, the world seemed to have lost all sense of color. The sky was a dull, oppressive shade of gray, and the trees in the distance stood like twisted sentinels. But what truly struck him was the thick, swirling fog that choked the land beneath it. The world outside the window felt like it was part of another reality, something distorted and far removed from the life Jason had once known. Jason could feel the weight of the house behind him, the air around him becoming heavier with each passing second. He turned back to the door, but before he could move, the floor beneath him trembled. The walls began to groan, as if the house itself was waking up. His breath caught in his throat. It was as though the house had been alive this whole time, waiting for him, watching him. The whispering voice returned, louder now. "You will never leave this place. The house won't let you." A cold gust of wind rushed through the room, even though the window was shut tight. Jason staggered back, his mind racing. This was no ordinary house. It was a living, breathing entity, and whatever had happened to Sarah was deeply tied to it. Whatever dark force had consumed her wasn't just in her. It was in everything. The house, the walls, the very air. It all felt alive, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the door behind him creaked open. Jason spun around, expecting to see Sarah standing there, but it wasn't her. Instead, a tall, shadowy figure loomed in the doorway, its face obscured by a deep, hooded cloak. For a moment, Jason thought he saw something glint in the figure's eyes. Something not quite human. The figure stepped into the room, its presence seeming to suck the very light from the air. Jason backed away instinctively. the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He had no idea who or what this was, but it didn't matter. There was nowhere to run. The figure didn't speak, but its gaze, cold and unblinking, was enough. It was a silent command. It was as if the figure was there to escort him somewhere he didn't want to go. The figure reached up with a long, skeletal hand, pointing toward the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to darken. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he watched the figure's hand move, almost in slow motion, as if time itself had been altered. With a final glance at the doorway, Jason took a hesitant step forward. What choice did he have? He couldn't stay in this room. He needed to understand what was happening, and that meant following whatever force had brought him here. He stepped into the darkened corner, his breath quickening. The shadows there seemed to bend and warp, stretching in unnatural ways, as though the very fabric of the room was changing before his eyes. Then, a voice echoed in his mind. "You've always known. It's always been here." The darkness shifted again, and Jason felt himself being drawn into it, his vision narrowing until all he could see was the deep blackness surrounding him. The walls seemed to close in, and the floor beneath him felt like it was sinking, as if he were being pulled into the very bowels of the earth. The floor groaned as though it too were alive. Jason stumbled forward, but before he could react, the darkness swallowed him whole. The world around Jason seemed to dissolve, replaced by a thick, suffocating blackness. He couldn't tell if his suffocating blackness. He couldn't tell if his eyes were open or shut, if he was still standing or falling. The sensation of being pulled deeper into the abyss was overwhelming, like gravity itself had reversed. For a brief moment, he felt weightless, his body drifting as if floating through an endless void. But then a crackling sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as the sound shifted, becoming a loud whereas the sound shifted, becoming something that seemed to come from all directions, vibrating deep within his bones. It was like the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Suddenly, light, it didn't come in the usual way. It didn't brighten the darkness or banish it. Instead, it crept in like a shadow, flickering at the edges of his vision. It was unnatural cold, blue, and flickering like an old television screen coming to life. The light seemed to pulse in rhythm with the dark whispers around him. He took a shaky step forward, his legs unsteady, as if the ground beneath him wasn't solid at all. His hand reached out, instinctively feeling the air ahead of him. It was damp, cold, and alive. The sensation that something unseen was brushing against his skin sent a chill up his spine. He wasn't alone. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he took another step, and then another. The flickering light in front of him grew stronger, but it wasn't illuminating anything. It was just more shadow. He couldn't make out the details, but he could feel that the walls around him were closing in. The space seemed to contract with every heartbeat. Something was moving, shifting and watching him. "Sarah?" Jason whispered, but the words barely escaped his lips. They were swallowed by the blackness before they could even leave his mouth. His voice felt hollow, useless. He couldn't even hear his own heartbeat in this place. Only the low hum of Anne. Energy he couldn't explain. The voice that answered, however, was clear. It wasn't Sarah's voice. It wasn't human at all. It was deeper, distorted, but somehow still recognizable, like something imitating her, something trying to sound familiar but missing the warmth of life. "You think you can escape?" Jason froze, his breath hitching in his throat. That voice? The tone was dark, guttural and chilling, like a distorted echo in his mind. But it wasn't Sarah. It wasn't human. Jason's feet refused to move. He tried to look around, but the darkness was so dense, so overwhelming, that all he could see was the faint, flickering light in front of him. A shape began to emerge from the edges of the light. At first, it was only a shadow, blurred, indistinct, but slowly, painfully, slowly, the shape took form. It was Sarah, or something that looked like her. Her figure was contorted, as though her body had been twisted into something inhuman. Her limbs were too long, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her skin, pale and natural, stretched taut over bones, had an unnatural sheen, almost as though it were slick with something that wasn't human. But it was her face, her eyes, that made Jason's blood run cold. Her eyes were wide open, impossibly so, black as voids, and as voids, and as voids, and as she turned to face him, they seemed to swirl, spinning like a vortex of darkness, pulling at his very soul. "No," Jason whispered, stumbling back. His mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. He had to get out of up here. He had to escape. "You can't escape," the voice repeated. But now, it wasn't just Sarah's form speaking. It came from everywhere, from within the walls, from the shadows around him, reverberating through his skull. "You belong to us." "Now?" Jason shook his head, his breathing shallow. He couldn't think. His heart was pounding in his chest, and the sense of dread was overwhelming, suffocating. The figure, the twisted version of Sarah, moved closer, her head jerking unnaturally to one side, her grin growing wider. But now her smile was no longer familiar. It was filled with malice, with something that was not human. Suddenly, Jason broke free from his paralysis. He turned and ran, the light flickering from his paralysis. He turned and ran, the light flickering behind him as the whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were deafening in his ears. The walls of this nightmarish world seemed to stretch and bend as he raced through the darkness, but no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't escape it. It was closing in on him, tightening around him like a noose. He had to find the way out. He had to survive. The ground beneath him cracked and groaned, the very earth moving like it was alive. But Jason didn't stop. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel the presence following him, closing the gap. Whatever this place was, whatever force had claimed Sarah, it wasn't done with him yet. It would never be done. The darkness ahead of him shifted again, and through the twisting shifted again, and through the twisting, pulsating shadows, Jason saw something that made his blood run cold. A doorway, faint but visible, light spilled from it. Not the flickering, ghostly light of the world he was trapped in, but a bright, almost blinding light. He ran toward blinding light. He ran toward it, desperation fueling his every step. As he reached the doorway, the pull of the darkness was too strong, trying to drag him back, but he pushed through, stumbling into the light, breaking through the barrier for a moment. Everything went silent. The whispers stopped. The pressure on his chest lifted. The air was fresh, clean. Jason looked around, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the light. He was outside. The forest was still there, stretching out before him in the soft glow of the moon, but everything felt different. The trees, the sky, even the air, it all seemed too still, too silent. He was back in the real world, but somehow the feeling of dread didn't leave him. "Sarah?" Jason whispered, looking around, but there was no answer, no twisted figure, no sign of the nightmare he had just escaped. He stood there for a moment, trying to process what had happened. Had it all been a dream? Was he truly outside? But deep down, he knew the darkness wasn't gone. It was still watching, still waiting for him to let his guard down. Jason turned to leave, his feet moving faster, the sensation of being pursued creeping back into his spine. The escape had only been temporary, and as he glanced over his shoulder, he realized that the twisted face of Sarah was still there, hidden in the shadows, waiting. Jason's heart raced as he ran, his feet pounding against the ground, each step taking him against the ground, each step taking him farther away from the place he had just escaped. He didn't know how he had gotten outside, nor did he understand how he could still feel the pull of the darkness behind him. It was as though something invisible was dragging at his soul, a tether away at his soul that refused to let go. He glanced over his shoulder, but the forest was empty. The moonlight filtered through the thick branches, casting long, ghostly shadows across the forest floor. Yet, despite the stillness, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. It was as if the darkness itself had followed him, watching him from the corners of his vision. His breath came in ragged gasps as he slowed down, trying to steady his pulse. The overwhelming urge to look behind him was almost too much to resist, but he forced himself to keep moving forward, his legs shaky and unsteady. Then he heard it. A low, guttural sound echoed through the forest, a whispering that seemed to come from every direction at once. Jason to come from every direction at once. Jason froze, his blood running cold. The voice, it was the same one he had heard earlier, the voice of Sarah's twisted form. "You can never leave." It was the same words, but this time they sounded different. They weren't just words. They were a command, a promise. Jason's heart hammered in his chest as he spun around, but the forest was still empty. The shadows stretched out around him like reaching fingers, and for a moment, he felt as though the entire world was closing in on him. He had to get away. He had to escape, but the air was thick now, suffocating, pressing against him from all sides. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal hands reaching for him. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm, and Jason realized with a sickening certainty that they weren't just in his head. They were real. He wasn't alone. With a surge of adrenaline, Jason pushed himself forward, sprinting through the forest. His feet stumbled over roots and rocks, but he couldn't stop. The shadows behind him seemed to grow larger, more solid, as if they were chasing him, hunting him down. "You can't run forever." The voice came again, but this time it was much closer. Jason's eyes, it was much closer, widened as he spun around, his breath catching in his throat. And there, standing just a few feet away, was Sarah, or at least the twisted version of her. Her eyes glowed in the darkness, the same haunting, empty black pits that had consumed her before. But now, her form was no longer just a distorted reflection. She was fully present, standing in the clearing with him, her body moving unnaturally, jerking with each step. "You're still here," Jason gasped, his voice shaky. "How are you?" But before he could finish his sentence, Sarah's form shifted, moving with unnatural speed, her arms stretching out toward him. Her mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, as if her entire face were splitting in two. Jason stumbled backward, his howled hinds 4 feet slipping on the forest floor. "No," he breathed, his mind racing. "No, no, no!" But Sarah was upon him in an instant, her cold, clammy hand gripping his arm with an unnatural strength. Her fingers dug into his skin, and Jason could feel the chill of her touch seeping into his bones. "You belong to us now," she whispered, her voice low and guttural, like it was coming from the depths of the earth itself. "We always have." Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to break free, but it was no use. The darkness had claimed her, and now it was claiming him, too. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating him, dragging him into the abyss. The world around him seemed to distort, the trees bending and twisting, the ground beneath his feet shifting like quicksand. But then, something shifted. A flicker of light broke through the oppressive darkness, a soft glow that seemed to pulse with life. For a moment, Jason thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But as the light grew stronger, he realized it was real. The shadows around him seemed to pull back, just for a moment, as if they were afraid of the light. Sarah recoiled as the light illuminated her, her form flickering like a flame in the wind. Jason's grip on reality was slipping, but in that moment, he knew what he had to do. He reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers trembling as he pulled out the small flashlight that had been with him from the very beginning. He had never thought it would be useful, but now it was his only hope. The light it cast felt weak, fragile, but it was enough to push back the darkness just for a moment. With all the strength he could muster, Jason turned the flashlight towards Sarah. The beam of light hit her full in the face, and, for the first time, her form hesitated. The darkness around her seemed to shudder, as if it didn't want to touch the light. "Stay back!" Jason shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. "Get away from me!" But Sarah didn't retreat. Instead, she laughed, a high-pitched, disturbing sound that sent shivers down Jason's spine. The shadows around her twisted, thickening, growing darker, as if they were drawing power from her. "You think this light will save you?" she hissed, her smile stretching impossibly wide. "You cannot escape the darkness." Jason's heart sank, but he refused to let the fear take over. The light was all he had left. He focused on it, holding the flashlight steady as he aimed it directly at Sarah's face. The light grew brighter, cutting through the darkness like a knife, and Sarah's form began to flicker, as though it were struggling to stay solid for a moment. Jason thought it might work, but then, as the shadows were crazy and glaring as the shadow's face pushed back against the light, he felt something pull him forward, something unseen wrapping around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. "Help me," he gasped, struggling to breathe. The light flickered again. Enough. He could feel the pull of the darkness stronger now, dragging him into the abyss, where the eyes were waiting. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the light went out. The shadows consumed him once more. Jason gasped. His breath catching in his throat as the light disappeared. The eerie darkness closed in on him, wrapping around him like cold, suffocating hands. His mind raced, panic setting in as he struggled to make sense of what was happening. The world around him was no longer real. It felt like a nightmare, a twisted version of reality where nothing made sense and everything was hostile. He tried to move, to run, but his feet felt heavy, as though the ground itself was holding him in place. The air was holding him in place, thick with the oppressive weight of the darkness, and he could hear the whispers again, louder now, more insistent. They were coming from every direction, crawling into his mind, pulling at his sanity. "You cannot escape." The voice was Sarah's, but it wasn't. It was distorted, as if the house itself was speaking through her. The darkness seemed to mold itself around her, forming a grotesque, twisted version of the girl he once knew. Her eyes glowed with that same unnatural light, and her smile, if it could still be called a smile, was something that no human should ever wear. "Sarah," Jason's voice cracked, desperation flooding his words. "Please, what happened to you?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, her twisted form advanced slowly, almost lazily, as though she were savoring every second of his fear. The darkness seemed to crawl behind her, moving with an intelligence of its own. She raised a hand toward him, and the air around him grew even colder. the shadows curling around his legs, pulling at him, dragging him toward her. "I never wanted this, Jason," she whispered, her voice sounding like it was coming from deep within the ground. "But now, I'm free. We're free." Jason's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. This wasn't just Sarah. It never had been. The Sarah he had known was gone, replaced by something that wasn't human, something that had been twisted by the house, by the curse. The same curse that had ensnared this place, this town. And now it had claimed her. And maybe, just maybe, it wanted him too. He fought against the shadows that were pulling him forward, his heart pounding in his word. He can't Lara cheer the house. The word get. They're pulling him forward, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to push himself away from her. But the force was too strong. The darkness was alive, moving around him like liquid, suffocating him, drowning him. "No," Jason gasped, his voice trembling. "I want be like you." Sarah smiled again, her expression a mix of pity and malice. "It's too late for you, Jason. We are all part of it now. You can't escape." Jason's breath came in shallow gasps as the darkness pressed in from all sides. His mind raced for a solution. Anything that could save him. He had to get out. He had to find a way to break free from this nightmare. But how? And then, just as everything seemed to collapse into the shadows, he remembered something: the flashlight. The light. It wasn't much, but it had worked before. Maybe it could work again. With trembling hands, Jason reached into his pocket and pulled out the flashlight. The darkness seemed to recoil as his fingers wrapped around it, and for a moment, the whispers grew louder, almost panicked. Jason didn't hesitate. He twisted the flashlight on, aiming it directly at Sarah's distorted form. For a moment, nothing happened then. A low hiss sounded from Sarah, followed by a terrible screech. The darkness around them flickered, distorting, as though it was being burned by the light. Jason's heart leaped in his quick chest as the shadows seemed to pull back, shrinking away from the beam of light. The whispers turned to screams, the voice of Sarah fading into something else, something unrecognizable. Jason pushed the flashlight closer, the light growing brighter, more intense, until the entire room seemed to glow. "Leave me alone," Jason shouted, his voice filled with determination. "I won't let you take me." The shadows screamed in agony as the light sliced through them. Jason didn't know how long he held the flashlight there, but it felt like an eternity. The darkness writhed and twisted, the air growing colder with each passing second, but the light held steady, burning through the evil that had taken hold of Sarah. And then, with a final, deafening scream, the darkness collapsed in on itself. The light itself flickered once, then went out. Jason stumbled backward, his legs weak and unsteady, but he was free. The room was silent now. The oppressive weight of the darkness had lifted, leaving only the faintest trace of what had been. Sarah's twisted form was gone, vanishing into the ether, leaving behind only an empty, silent space. Jason fell to his knees, gasping for air. His heart was still racing, his body trembling with exhaustion, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a temporary reprieve. The house, the curse, the darkness, it was still there, lurking in the corners of his mind, waiting for the right moment to return. But for now, Jason was alive. He had escaped, and that, for the moment, was enough. Jason sat there in the darkness, his breathing heavy, the cold air around him still, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The silence that followed was almost too much to bear. He had faced the darkness, the twisted form of Sarah, and the horrors that had inhabited this place, and for now, He had won, but in his gut, there was a gnawing feeling that the battle wasn't over. He stood up slowly, his legs unsteady, as if the ground had lost its solidness. The light, as if the ground had lost its solidness. The light from the flashlight had dissipated, and with it, the immediate threat. But Jason couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the cracked windows seemed to be a signal that something still lingered in the shadows, waiting. Jason looked around the room. It was now eerily still. The familiar furniture, the cluttered objects, all were covered in dust, but nothing seemed to be out of place. Yet, something was different. Very air felt heavier, as if the house itself had been holding on to its dark secret for years, and now it was awake. Jason could feel it in the pit of his stomach, an ancient force that hadn't been banished entirely. It was still there. It was still there, somewhere, hidden in the corners of the room, in the walls, in the air. He had to leave. The thought hit him with a sudden urgency, and his feet carried him to the door without hesitation. The hallway beyond was just as dark and quiet as but there was something about it that seemed to pulse with a life of its own, like it was watching him, measuring his every step. Jason made his way down the hallway, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He tried to keep his footsteps light, but the silence was oppressive, heavy on his chest as he approached the stairs. A sound echoed through the house, a low, guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't a whisper this time, but something else, something far more primal. He froze, his hand hovering over the banister. The house seemed to shift around him, the shadows stretching and flickering in the corners of his vision. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling pressing lower. His breath became shallow, each exhale a puff of cold air, and he felt his heart race again. "Not again," he muttered under his breath, trying to steady himself. But as he stepped down onto the first step, he felt it whole, the same force that had dragged him into the darkness earlier. It tugged at him, a weight on his chest, a pressure building from all around. Jason stopped, his foot still resting on the step, unable to move forward. He could hear Theodore whisper again, faint but unmistakable. "You thought it was over?" The voice sent a shiver through his spine. It wasn't Sarah anymore. This voice was deeper, older, like it had lived in the very walls of the house. Jason's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. He had been so sure he was free, but the house-cursed, living thing wasn't ready to let go of him just yet. Jason turned toward the door at the far end of the hallway, where he had seen the light earlier, but now the light was gone. The door was closed. The dark hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, as though the space itself was growing, folding in on him. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs felt frozen. It was as if the house was holding him in place, trapping him in the web of its dark influence. He knew he couldn't stay here any longer. The door at the end of the hallway might have been his only chance to escape, to find his way back to the real world. Taking a deep breath, Jason forced himself to move. He had to break the hold that the house had over him. His feet shuffled forward, but each step felt like wading through thick, viscous air, the pull growing stronger with every inch. He reached the door and grasped the handle, but it didn't open. It was stuck, as if something or someone was on the other side, keeping him from leaving. With a grunt, Jason shoved against the door. It didn't budge. The pressure in the air intensified, and the sound of the whispers grew louder, more desperate, more frantic. "You frantic, can't leave, Jason," the voice hissed. "You are ours now." Jason slammed his shoulder into the door, pushing with all his strength. The door creaked, then slowly began to give way. His heart pounded as the darkness behind him seemed to surge. forward, but he didn't stop. He pushed harder until with one final effort, the door flew open, revealing an empty room beyond. Jason stumbled forward, his breath ragged, his body on the edge of collapse. The room was bare, nothing but old furniture and dust. It looked almost ordinary, but there was something about it, something that didn't sit right. A cold draft brushed his face, and he felt a sudden rush of relief. He was outside, he thought, but the moment he crossed the threshold, he felt it. The pull was gone. The house was no longer controlling him. But there was still a presence behind him. A sense of something waiting, watching. As Jason stepped out of the house, the mist began to lift, and the air grew lighter. He stood on the doorstep for a moment, looking out at the empty streets. He was free, for now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the house, the curse, wasn't finished with him. It was like a shadow that would follow him wherever he went, always lurking, always waiting for the right moment to return. Jason turned away from the house, the feeling of dread still clinging to him. He didn't look back as he walked down the road. The nightmare was over, for now, but he knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before the darkness returned, and when it did, would he be ready to face it again? Jason walked away from the house, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence of the night. The mist had cleared, but the unease still clung to him like a second skin. The street ahead was empty, the world around him still and cold. He didn't know where he was going. All he knew was that he had to get as far away from that house as possible. As he walked, the strange sense of being watched never left him. His heart still raced, his mind reeling with the images of Sarah's twisted form, the house that seemed to breathe with life, and the voice that had followed him, always present in the background. He tried to push it all aside, tried to focus on putting distance between himself and the nightmare, but it was impossible. Every shadow in the distance felt like it was reaching for him. Every creak of the ground beneath him sent a jolt of fear through his body. He could feel the darkness still lingering, just beyond the edge of his perception, always there, waiting. Jason's thoughts drifted back to Sarah. The girl he had once known was gone. In her place was something else, something ancient, twisted by the darkness that had overtaken her, and now, that darkness seemed to be tied to him. As much as he tried to push it away, he could feel it creeping into his soul, like a stain that wouldn't wash out. His legs grew tired, the exhaustion of everything he had just been through settling in, but he couldn't stop. He had to keep up. He had to keep up moving. He had to find a way to break free from this curse, from the pull of the darkness that was always there, just beyond the reach of his senses. Eventually, he found himself at the edge of town. The buildings were sparse here, the streets empty. The town felt like it had been abandoned, left behind by whatever force had claimed Sarah. There were no signs of no cars, no people, just the occasional flicker of a light from the houses that lined the street. Jason stopped in front of one of the houses, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Something felt wrong. The house in front of him was old, weathered, like the rest of the buildings in the town, but there was something about it that made his skin crawl. It felt familiar. He stepped closer, drawn to it. The closer he got, the more the air seemed to hum with a strange energy. It wasn't the same as the house where he had just escaped, but it was similar. The same weight in the air, the same weight in the air, the same weight. Oppressive silence. The windows were dark, but he could feel something watching him from within. Jason's pulse quickened, but he couldn't tear his gaze away. He stepped up to the door, his hand reaching for the handle before he could even stop himself. The door creaked open, as though it had been waiting for him. Inside, the air was thick, almost suffocating. and the smell of old wood and decay filled his nostrils. He stepped inside, his feet moving of their own accord. The floorboards groaned under his weight, but there was no turning back now. He had come too far, and a strange, compelling force was guiding him deeper into the house. The hall stretched out in front of him, long and dark. The walls were covered, long and dark, in peeling wallpaper, and the air was heavy with dust. Everything about this place felt like it had been untouched for years, abandoned long ago. Yet, as Jason moved deeper into the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't empty at all. He continued down the hallway, his steps echoing in the silence. As he reached the end, he found himself standing in front of a door that seemed to be calling him. It was an old wooden door, scratched and worn, but something about it felt familiar. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he reached for the handle, his hand shaking as it made contact with the cold metal. He turned the knob, pushing the door open slowly. The room beyond was dark, but as he stepped inside, the air seemed to shift. The shadows in the room felt alive, shifting with every breath he took. The dim light from the hallway barely illuminated the space, but it was enough to see that the room was filled with old furniture, chairs, tables, cabinets, each piece covered in dust, as if the house had been waiting, unchanged, for someone to enter. But there, in the center of the room, was something that made Jason's blood run cold: a mirror. It was large, ornate, with a gilded frame that had long since tarnished with age. The glass was cracked in several places, but there was something about it that drew Jason's attention. It was as if the mirror was calling to him, pulling him toward it. Found his legs moving toward the mirror. His eyes locked onto the reflection. The moment he gazed into the glass, his breath caught in his throat. For a split second, he saw himself, but then, behind him. At first, Jason thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but as he looked closer, he saw it more clearly. The figure was tall, thin, and its face was hidden in shadow, but the eyes glowed with the same dark, the hollow intensity that had filled Sarah's face before. Jason's heart stopped. The figure in the mirror moved slowly. It lifted a hand and reached out toward him, its long, thin fingers stretching toward the glass. Jason froze, unable to look lost. Jason froze, unable away. He could feel the cold touch of the figure's presence, as though the air around him had turned icy. The hand in the mirror seemed to move closer, until it was just inches away from his own reflection. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered again, this time louder, more insistent. The figure's lips didn't move, but Jason could hear the words clearly, as if they were being spoken directly into his mind. With a sudden jolt, Jason snapped out of his trance. He stumbled back, his heart racing, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He turned away from the mirror, but the image of the figure, the eyes, was burned into his mind. He had to get out of there. As he turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Jason spun around, his pulse pounding in his ears. The room was dark, and the oppressive air was thick, like a weight pressing down on him. The mirror, now shattered, lay in pieces on the floor, reflecting fractured images of the room around him, but there was no escape. The figure in the mirror was now standing in front of him, its hollow eyes locked onto his, drawing him closer, pulling him into its embrace. Jason's heart raced as he tried to back away, but the darkness was closing in on him, its tendrils reaching for him, suffocating him. And he knew, in that moment, that no matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he fought, he would never escape. Jason's body trembled. His body trembled, his legs stiff with fear as he backed away from the shattered mirror. His eyes never left the figure that had materialized in front of him, its movements slow and deliberate. The creature's hollow eyes seemed to pierce through him, and Jason could pierce through him and Jason feel his mind slipping, his thoughts becoming more chaotic with each passing second. The air in the room was thick, suffocating, pressing in from all sides, making it harder to breathe. His vision blurred, and the very walls seemed to stretch it and pulse with the beating of his heart. He tried to move, but his body felt paralyzed, as if the darkness itself had wrapped its cold fingers around him. Every part of him screamed to run, to escape, but the air was heavy, and the presence of the figure was oppressive, like it was everywhere, in the very marrow of his bones. The figure in front of him took another step forward, its body shifting in and out of focus, like a wisp of smoke that couldn't quite hold its form. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that were long and thin, reaching out towards him with fingers that seemed to grow as they moved. The darkness in its eyes swirled with a life of its own, and the more Jason stared at it, the more he felt himself being drawn into those eyes. It wasn't just watching him anymore. It was inside him, twisting his thoughts, pulling at the deepest corners of his mind. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure whispered, its voice echoing through the room like a distant memory. The words sounded like Sarah's voice at first, but there was something wrong with it, something hollow and fragmented. Jason stumbled back again, but this time he felt the cold fingers of the darkness grip him, pushing him towards the figure. His heartbeat pounded in his chest, and sweat clung to his skin, but he couldn't fight it. Every inch closer to the figure felt like a step further into an abyss, and he could feel his mind fraying at the edges. "No," Jason gasped, his voice breaking. He pushed with all his might, but it felt like the room was pressing in on him, like the walls were collapsing, closing in from all sides. The figure's lips curled into a smile, wide and unsettling, stretching impossibly far. Its eyes flickered with an intensity that seemed to burn through him. "You are already part of it," it whispered. "You are ours now." The room seemed to contract, the shadows swallowing the space around him until it shined away. Until gone alone. I crossed your name. And ours straw. Theirs was just the figure, and Jason standing in a void of suffocating dark. The figure's voice grew louder, its words more insistent. "There is no escape. The darkness is endless, and now, you are mine." Jason's hands trembled as he reached out for anything to hold on to. His fingers brushed against something cold and smooth wood. The door, the exit. He lunged for the handle, pulling it desperately, but it didn't budge. His strength was no match for whatever force had sealed him in on this nightmare. "Help me!" he screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "Please, help me!" But there was no one. No one could hear him. Not anymore. The figure in front of him moved closer, and Jason could feel the air turning colder. Sharper, the temperature dropped, the chill biting into his skin, numbing his limbs. The darkness seemed to respond to the figure, growing heavier, thicker, until Jason could no longer see anything but those glowing eyes, the black abyss that pulled him in, deeper and deeper. Suddenly, a flash of light, a small flicker, persistent, appeared at the far end of the room. Jason's eyes snapped toward it, his heart lurching with hope. Could it be? Was there a way out? Could the light push back the darkness? The figure stopped, its gaze flicking toward the light, a low growl rumbling from its chest. It recoiled, just for a moment, as though the light had disturbed it, but it quickly regained its focus on Jason. "You think that light can save you?" "It only delays the inevitable." Jason didn't listen. His instinct took over, and he moved toward the light, his body moving, as if on its own. The shadows seemed to reach for him, clawing at his legs, but the light was growing stronger now, illuminating the room in a bright, searing glow. He pushed forward, his breath ragged, his body on the brink of collapse. The figure shrieked in anger, but Jason didn't stop. As he reached the light, he could feel its warmth surrounding him, engulfing him in a cocoon of safety. The air felt lighter, and for a moment, the pressure on his chest eased. He dared to look back at the figure, but it was gone. The darkness, too, seemed to retreat, swirling away like smoke. The light smoke enveloped him completely, and for the first time since entering this cursed place, Jason felt a sense of calm. The whispers faded into nothing, the oppressive air lifted, and he could breathe again. His pulse began to steady, and the fear that had consumed him began to dissipate, replaced by a strange, peaceful stillness. But then, as quickly as it had come, the light began to flicker. Jason turned around in alarm. But the room had changed. It was no longer the dark, oppressive space it had been moments before. It was brighter, but the walls were cracked. The floor was broken, and the air was cold again. Voice whispered from behind him. "You think you're free?" it asked. "You can't outrun the darkness. It always comes back." Jason spun around, but there was nothing there. No figure. No Sarah. Just the dark, broken room stretching endlessly before him. He wasn't free, not yet. The darkness hadn't let go. It had only been waiting for him to think he was safe. And in the silence, he heard it again. The whisper just behind him, in the shadows. "You belong to us." Jason's heart raced as the whisper echoed through the room, vibrating and through his chest, his mind, his very soul. The darkness hadn't gone, it was simply hiding, waiting for him to let his guard down, waiting for that moment of weakness. But he couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not when he was so close to escape. He turned around, scanning the room for any sign of the presence that had been haunting him. The air felt thick, the weight of it pressing on his chest, as though the room itself were alive, watching, waiting. He clenched his fists, the cold sweat still coating his palms. He needed to act. There was no other choice. The light flickered once more, dimming for a fraction of a second, but just enough for Jason to see something move in the corner of his eye. He spun toward it, but there was nothing there, just the decaying remnants of the room. His breath hitched in his throat as he stepped cautiously toward the spot where he'd seen the movement. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, cutting off his escape. Jason's pulse shot through his veins, a wave of panic washing over him. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the shadows grew longer, darker. He could feel the presence surrounding him once again. "Close," the voice whispered again, but this time, it wasn't just Sarah's distorted tone. It was a chorus, a cacophony of voices, each one distinct yet blending together into a single, terrifying sound.
"You are ours, Jason. Forever, Jason. Forever, Jason. Forever,"
stumbled back, his mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of what was happening. It wasn't just Sarah. It wasn't just a curse or a haunted house. This was something deeper, something older, an entity that had been waiting for the right moment to claim him. He didn't know how or why, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let it take him. The light was still flickering, but it wasn't as strong as before. The glow that had been his lifeline was now dimming, fading, and the darkness surged forward to fill the void it left behind. Jason felt the pull again, but this time he fought against it, pushing with all his might to keep his body moving. His feet felt heavy, like they were stuck in wet sand, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He ran toward the far side of the room, where he thought there might be another way out. A window, a door, anything. But as he reached the corner, he found himself facing another wall of solid darkness. There was no escape, no way out. Panic rose within him. His breath came in shallow, quick gasps as he turned in a circle, his eyes wide, looking for any sign of hope. The darkness pressed in from all sides, a tangible thing, an ever-present threat that seemed to seep into his skin, into his very bones. Jason slammed his fists into the wall, his body trembling with frustration, fear, and exhaustion. He couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't keep running, fighting. It felt like the darkness had already consumed him, like there was no way to win. But then, through the haze of his panic, something clicked in his mind, something deep, primal, and ancient. He realized that the darkness, too, it had been from the moment he stepped foot into this cursed place. It was a part of him now, as much as the air he breathed, the blood that pumped in his veins. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath. "You are ours, Jason, forever." The words echoed in his mind, but this time, they didn't terrify him. They didn't control him. The truth settled in. The darkness had been feeding on his fear, his desperation. It thrived on it. But if he could control that, if he could stop running, stop fighting maybe, just maybe, he could break free. He opened his eyes and let the light from the flashlight flood the room once more. This time, the light didn't flicker. It stayed bright. It stayed bright, unwavering. Jason held it steady, focusing on the beam. The darkness recoiled, retreating from the light, as though it couldn't stand to touch it. He took another step forward, his feet more sure now. "You won't have me," he whispered under his breath, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "I won't let you take me." For the first time since entering the house, Jason felt a flicker of power in his chest. It wasn't just the flashlight, the light, it was him. The strength, the will to survive, was within him. He had been so focused on the external horrors that he had forgotten the most important thing. The darkness could only control him if he let it, and he wouldn't let it any more. With renewed determination, he walked toward the center of the room, holding the flashlight high. The shadows fought back, surging forward, trying to swallow him whole, but the light cut through them, piercing the thick veil of darkness. He moved faster now, the light steady and strong, and the darkness began to recede. The voices in his mind, the whispers, the hiss of the shadows, they grew quieter, less insistent. The pull on his chest, the pressure that had threatened to crush him, started to fade slowly. The room began to change again. The oppressive weight lifted, the walls no longer closing in. Jason kept moving, the flashlight casting long, bright shadows across the room. The darkness wasn't gone, not yet, but it was retreating. He knew it wasn't over. This was only a temporary victory. But for the first time, he felt like he was in control. The darkness wasn't the only force at play here. He had something stronger, will, light, hope. And as he reached the door, which now seemed to open easily, he glanced back one last time. The figure, the shadow, had retreated to the far corner, its glowing eyes still watching him, but fading. He stepped out into the cold night, the world outside the house, still dark, but somehow less suffocating, less oppressive. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, Jason felt ready to face it. Jason stood outside the house, his legs unsteady beneath him, but his heart, for the first time in what felt like forever, wasn't pounding in his chest. The air was cold, and the night was silent, but the oppressive weight that had clung to him in that dark room had lifted. The darkness had retreated for now, but Jason knew it. Which paneth, adi, as adjust retreated for now, but Jason knew it wasn't gone. It was still out there, lurking, waiting for him to slip, waiting for him to let his guard down. He could feel its presence, like a shadow at the edge of his vision. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the house behind him, but it was gone. The structure that had been so real just moments ago had vanished, leaving nothing but an empty stretch of road and the overgrown brush of the forest. Jason's mind spun. Had it been a hallucination? Spun? Had it been a hallucination? Had he dreamed it all? No. He couldn't deny what he had felt, what he had experienced. The house, Sarah's twisted form. The darkness, it had all been real. But now, in the light of the moon, it felt as though the nightmare had lifted, leaving him with only the lingering taste of fear and uncertainty. A rustling sound from behind him made him freeze. His eyes darted around the empty road, but there was no sign of anyone. No footsteps, no movement, just the silence of the night. "You're not alone." The voice came again, soft but insistent, a whisper in the back of his mind. Jason's breath hitched as he spun around, but the road was still empty. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying gently in the wind. Nothing. Fists, trying to shake off the feeling that the shadows were closing in on him. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. There was nothing here. He was free, and yet the voice continued, persistent and cruel. "You can't escape." The air grew colder. "You can't escape." The breeze sharp and biting as it rushed past him. Jason's skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He turned quickly, looking for any sign of the thing that had been chasing him. But again, there was nothing. The road ahead stretched into the distance, the trees forming dark silhouettes against the dim light of the moon. Jason's heartbeat quickened. He was starting to feel dizzy, like the world around him was warping, bending, shifting in ways he couldn't understand. The darkness was still there, even if he couldn't see it. It was inside him, a part of him now. It had infected his mind, made him doubt everything around him. He needed to keep moving. Without another thought, Jason began to walk, his steps quick and purposeful. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to get away from here. Away from the presence that seemed to linger in the air like a heavy fog. His eyes stayed fixed on the ground. His thoughts stayed fixed on the ground. His thoughts racing. He had to escape the house. He had to escape the dark forest that had claimed Sarah, that had claimed this town. But the longer he walked, the more the feeling of being watched grew. It wasn't just a sensation anymore. It was real. It was real. It was as if something or someone was walking just behind him, mirroring his every step. "Turn around." Jason froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice was closer now, as if it were standing right next to him, whispering directly into his head, whispering directly into his ear. He had heard it before, but this time it felt different, more real, more immediate. "Turn around." He could feel the darkness pressing in, pulling at him, urging him to face whatever was following him. Jason wanted to keep walking, to ignore the voice, but the urge was too strong. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned around. The street behind him was empty, just as it had been before. The trees stood still, their branches bare against the night sky. Nothing. No figure, no shadow, just the same quiet road he had been walking down. But then he saw it there, in the distance, standing just at the edge of the road, was a figure. It was cloaked in shadow, its features obscured by the darkness. Jason's obscured by the darkness. Heart skipped a beat, his blood running cold as he realized what he was seeing. It was Sarah. Her twisted form stood there, unmoving, her eyes glowing in the darkness. The same vacant expression on her face, the same twisted smile that had haunted his mind since the moment he first saw her. She wasn't real. She couldn't be. He had escaped her, escaped the darkness. And yet, there she was. "You're not free, Jason." Her voice echoed through the night, hollow and mocking. "Jason." Her voice echoed through the night, hollow and mocking. Jason took a step back, his mind spinning. He didn't know how it was possible, but he knew that this wasn't just some trick of the mind. This wasn't a hallucination. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to shift, bending, warping. Why? The air around it seemed to shift, bending, warping, until the shadows themselves came alive. The world around him began to twist again, the edges of his vision blurring. Jason's body went rigid with fear as the darkness surged toward him. "Stop!" he shouted, but his voice barely reached above a whisper. "Leave me alone!" The darkness didn't respond. Instead, it closed in around him, swallowing the light of the moon, drowning him in its oppressive grip. The figure of Sarah remained still, its glowing eyes burning through the darkness. But now, it wasn't just Sarah anymore. There were other shapes, figures, their faces twisted and distorted, their eyes glowing with the same hollow light. "You cannot run, Jason. You cannot hide." The voices of the lost souls echoed around him, each one twisted and on him, each one twisted and distorted by the darkness that had taken root here. Jason could feel their cold hands reaching for him, could hear their whispers, their cries, all around him, each one pulling him deeper into the void. "No," Jason whispered. His legs shaking, his heart racing. "No, this isn't real. I won't let you." But it didn't matter. The darkness was too strong. The voices were too many. The figures were too close. Jason's breath became shallow, his vision narrowing, his vision narrowing, his body trembling as the pull of the darkness grew stronger. He could feel himself being dragged back into it, being swallowed whole by the very thing that had tormented him since the moment he first stepped into this cursed town. And then, just as he thought he couldn't fight anymore, the light returned. A faint glow, flickering at the edges of his vision, grew stronger with each passing second. The darkness recoiled, retreating as the light grew brighter, more powerful. Jason's pulse quickened as he reached for it, his fingers desperate to grasp onto the only thing that could save him. The light enveloped him, filling the space around him with warmth, with life. The shadows faded away, their presence retreating. Their presence retreating. Their presence retreating. Their presence retreating. Whispers silenced, and with the last breath of the darkness gone, Jason was left standing in the center of the road, bathed in the light of the moon. It was over. For now, Jason stood there, his body shaking as the last remnants of the darkness faded from the air. The night had returned to its unnatural stillness, the only sound the gentle rustling of the trees in the wind. But even though the light had pushed the shadows back, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, lurking just beyond his reach. It was as though the darkness had retreated, but it had left a mark, a scar on his soul that would never fade. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his chest as he stood frozen, staring into the distance. The world around him seemed to shift, the night sky above him darker than it should have been, the trees stretching unnaturally high. It was like the world itself had changed, like the very fabric of reality had been torn and stitched back together, but imperfectly, leaving holes where the darkness had once been. Jason couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. He had escaped the house. He had broken free from Sarah's twisted grip. Or so he'd broken free from Sarah's twisted grip. Or so he had broken free, thought. But there was something else, something deeper, something that still lingered in the corners of his mind. It had been following him since he stepped into that cursed house. And now, it was a part of him. As he turned away from the spot where Sarah had stood, his eyes scanned the empty road ahead. He couldn't see anything, but the sensation of being watched hadn't gone away. His feet moved mechanically, his legs carrying him forward, even though his mind screamed to turn back. He had to leave. He had to get as far away from this town as possible, as far away from the darkness that was still haunting him. The road stretched out before him, but no matter how far he walked, the feeling of being trapped, of being drawn back into the house, grew stronger. The night seemed to close in on him, the trees becoming thicker, the air heavier, the weight of the curse, the darkness seemed to press against him. And the voices were back. Voices were back, whispered from the shadows, too faint to understand, but Jason could feel them in his bones. He could feel their cold fingers brushing against him, their presence creeping into his mind. "You can't escape." The words were unmistakable. The same as before, the same voice that had been following him, the same whispers that had tormented him in the house. Jason's pulse quickened, and his steps faltered. He had to get away. He had to fight it. But how? How could he fight something that had already claimed him? The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Jason's breath caught in his throat as the world around him seemed to warp and twist again. The road ahead began to bend unnaturally, the trees curving inward like skeletal fingers closing in around him. The air grew thick and suffocating, and Jason's vision blurred as he felt himself being pulled toward the house once more. "You belong to us now." Jason's heart raced as the darkness surged toward him, filling his lungs with cold, suffocating, suffocating air. The light, the fleeting light that had saved him before so far away now, as though it had never existed. The shadows closed in on him from all sides, and for the first time since escaping the house, he felt truly helpless. He turned truly helpless. Run! But his feet felt like lead, his body too heavy to move. The weight of the darkness had grown too strong. It was overwhelming. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the shadows around him, the coldness of the night pressing against him from all directions. But then, through the fog of fear and exhaustion, something broke through. A figure standing at the end of the road, just where the shadows seemed to begin. Jason's eyes widened as he recognized the shape of figure he had seen before, a figure he thought he had left behind. It was Sarah. Her twisted form stood in the distance, her hollow eyes glowing with that same unnatural light. But this time, she wasn't alone. There were others with her, their shapes just beyond the edge of the light, their forms twisting and shifting, their eyes locked onto him with an eerie, predatory gaze. Jason's body trembled, his heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out the whispers. He couldn't go back. He couldn't face them again, but his legs moved on their own, carrying him forward toward the figure. The shadows seemed to pull at him, urging him to come closer, to step into the darkness, but Jason resisted. He fought against it, his mind racing for any escape, any way to break free. "Sarah," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "What have you become?" Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, it felt as though she was looking right through him. Her smile twisted unnaturally, and her voice echoed in his mind once more. "You are a part of us now, Jason, just like the others." The shadows behind her began to shift, and Jason felt his body grow cold with fear. The voices, the figures, they were closing in on him. There was no escape. But then, in the midst of the suffocating darkness, Jason felt a spark, a faint flicker of light in his chest, a warmth that seemed to grow brighter with each passing second. He had felt it before, that strange sense of power, that ability to fight back. He had survived before, and he would survive again. With a defiant shout, Jason raised his hand toward the ground, pushing against the darkness with every ounce of strength he had left. The light inside him grew brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat, cutting through the shadows. "You are not in control," he whispered, voice steady with newfound resolve. This is my fight now. The shadows recoiled, retreating from the light as if it were fire. The figures faltered, their forms flickering like they couldn't hold together in the presence of the light. Sarah's twisted face contorted in a snarl, but she didn't move. The darkness around her shrank, folding back like a tide pulling away from the shore. Jason took a step forward, then another. His body felt lighter now, freer. As the darkness retreated, the light in his chest burned brighter, and with every step, the shadows seemed to lose their grip on him. I won't let you win, he muttered under his breath. I won't let this consume me. The figure of Sarah trembled, flickering. Sarah trembled, flickering in and out of existence, her distorted form growing weaker with each passing second. The darkness around her collapsed, falling away like smoke, and just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. Jason stood alone on the road, the moonlight shining brightly overhead, the air still and calm. The whispers had stopped, the shadows had vanished, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jason felt truly free. But as he looked around, the faintest trace of doubt crept into his mind. Was it really over? Could he escape the darkness for good? He didn't know, but for now, he was alive, and that, he decided, would be enough. Jason stood in the stillness of the night, his body trembling with exhaustion, but the fear had faded, replaced by a lingering sense of disbelief. The darkness was gone, but the weight of what had happened still pressed heavily on his chest. He knew the nightmare wasn't truly over. He could still feel the echo of it, like a shadow in the back of his mind, waiting. He glanced around, the road before him now quiet, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, the house, the figures, the curse. They were all gone. Or were they? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, that the night still held secrets he couldn't comprehend. The forest around him felt vast and unyielding, its shadows darker now, as though they were hiding something just beyond the edge of his vision. The streetlights flickered, casting strange, wavering shadows that danced like specters along the road. He had to leave. He had to get away from this town. It was clear now that this wasn't just some random occurrence. This place, this cursed town, was something more. It was the source of it all. The house wasn't just a house, it was a doorway, a portal, a living thing that fed off of fear, despair, and darkness. And whatever had happened to Sarah, to those before her, to the very fabric of the town, it had left its mark on him. Jason turned and began to walk down the road, trying to shake off the feeling of being followed. His footsteps were the only sound in the night, and for a moment he heard a mouse, allowed himself to breathe, to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had escaped it. But then the whisper returned. You can't escape. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. Jason froze, his body stiffening at the gold glory of false, the trees words breeze sound. His breath hitched, but he forced himself not to turn around. He had to keep moving. He couldn't let it take him again. But the whisper came again, louder this time, and it wasn't coming from behind him. It was coming from everywhere, surrounding him, suffocating him. You're still part of us. Jason's pulse shot up in his chest, his hands trembling as the voice twisted and turned, slithering into his mind like a parasite. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder. He could feel the presence again, the dark force, hovering just at the edges of his perception. He opened his eyes to find the road ahead of him warping. The trees were twisting, their branches reaching toward him like skeletal hands. The ground beneath him felt unstable, shifting as though it were alive. breathing. The road was changing, shifting back into something darker. Something he hadn't seen before. The shadows were not just shadows anymore, they were waving, moving things. They reached toward him with clawed hands, trying to drag him back into the depths. Jason ran, panic flooding his body, his legs pumping as fast as they could carry him. He had to get away. He couldn't let it take him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted down the road, the shadows chasing him, the whispers growing louder with each step. He glanced behind him, and for a split second, he saw something, a figure, flickering in the darkness. Standing, a figure, flickering in the dark just at the edge of his vision. But when he turned to face it, it was gone. He ran harder, his pulse thudding in his ears. The road ahead twisted, like a maze that was closing in on him. Every time he thought he was nearing the end, the path he was nearing the end stretched out further, pulling him deeper into the dark. Jason could feel it now. The darkness wasn't just following him, it was pulling him back into it. His heart raced, and he felt his chest tighten, his body growing heavier as though the sewer center is all this sour and sugar. His body growing heavier as though the weight of the night itself was dragging him down. The shadows wrapped around him, the whispering voices deafening in his mind. You can't escape. You are ours. Jason's legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground. The earth to the ground beneath him was cold and wet, and the shadows circled, closing in. The darkness pressed in, suffocating him, trying to swallow him whole. But then, something inside him snapped. He couldn't let it happen. Not again. He stood up, shaking. He stood up, shaking. His breath shallow, but steady. His body was covered in sweat, his hands trembling. But there was something inside him now, a spark of defiance. A strength that he hadn't known was there. With a deep breath, Jason turned to face the shadows. No, he shouted, his voice stronger than he felt. I will not be yours. For a moment, the darkness hesitated. The shadows seemed to falter, wavering in the air, as if unsure of how to respond. But Jason could feel the energy shifting, the pull of the dark force weakening. Just for a moment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the flashlight, his hand shaking as he held it up. The light flickered at first, but then it steadied, glowing brighter and brighter with each passing second. The shadows recoiled as the beam of light cut through them, dispelling the darkness with every pulse of brightness. Stay back, Jason yelled, his voice steady now, full of power. This is my light. You cannot take it. The shadows screamed in agony, their forms flickering and distorting. But Jason kept the light steady, pushing forward. The darkness shrieked, writhing like it was being burned by the light, and with every inch Jason advanced, the shadows pulled back, retreating into the night. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the road ahead of him cleared. The darkness dissipated completely, and for the first time, the night felt still. The oppressive weight lifted. Jason looked us around, his breath ragged, his body sore and exhausted. But he was alive. He had done it. For now, but deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. The darkness, whatever it was, would never truly leave him. It was in him now. And one day, it was in him now, would return. But Jason was ready. He had faced it once, and next time, he would be ready for it. Jason stood there, his chest heaving, as the last traces of the darkness faded away. The road in front of him seemed impossibly calm, thick, oppressive airlifting, leaving only the cold stillness of the night. He tried to catch his breath, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline, but his heart would slow. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. He turned around to face the empty stretch of road, the forest to his side, dark and silent. The house was no longer in sight. but the weight of the experience lingered on his shoulders, pressing down on him like a heavy fog. The cursed town had already twisted his perception of reality, and now it seemed to stretch out before him in all its unsettling quiet. Jason had fought the darkness, but he knew the truth now. The dark force had always been there, always lurking, and it would always be waiting for him. The house might be gone, but the curse, the malevolent energy, had followed him. It had rooted itself deep within him, and he could feel it, creeping into the corners of his mind, gnawing at his thoughts. Not this time, he whispered to himself, not again. He gripped the flashlight tighter, the light still flickering weakly in his hand, though it offered him no warmth. It was as though the darkness had already left its mark on him, inside him. The shadows he had seen had felt real, far too real, and no matter how much light he shined, it never felt like he had truly escaped. Jason began walking, though his legs felt like lead, and his mind seemed to spin with every step. He wasn't sure where he was going. He didn't know if it mattered. As he walked, his thoughts drifted back to Sarah, her twisted smile, her haunting eyes. It had all felt so real, but now even her image felt like a memory fading in the distance. It was as though the house had consumed her, twisted her into something dark, and Jason had been helpless to stop it. Had she ever really been human? Or had she been another pawn in the house's game? Another victim to the darkness? A cold breeze swept through the trees, making him shiver, and he pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. He needed answers. He needed to understand what had happened here, what the house truly was, and why it had targeted him. He, a Turgos truly was, and why it had targeted him. Wasn't sure he could face it, but there was no other option. If he didn't confront it now, it would follow him forever. He couldn't let that happen. As Jason walked further down the road, he began to notice the signs. At first, they were subtle. The distant echo of footsteps behind him, too faint to catch, but unmistakable. The faint rustle of leaves, but no wind then, more distinct. The whispering voices, too soft to understand, but clear enough to make his heart race. It was as if the darkness was always there, just beyond his sight, watching, waiting. Jason's stomach churned. He wasn't alone. He spun around, expecting to see someone or something standing just behind him. But there was nothing. The road was empty, the trees dark and silent. It's not real, he muttered under his breath, trying to steady his racing heart. You're just hearing things? But deep down, Jason knew. It wasn't just his imagination. It was real. The house, the shadows, the voices, it was all real. And it was still here, waiting for him. The whispers grew louder, and this time, Jason could make out the words. You can't outrun it, Jason. His breath hitched in his throat. He wasn't imagining it. The darkness had followed him, and now it was back. The ground beneath him shifted, and Jason felt a sudden, overwhelming pull like the earth itself was drawing him in. His heart pounded as his body was yanked forward. Almost against his body was yanked forward. Well, he tried to fight it, tried to plant his feet firmly on the ground, but it was no use. The shadows were pulling him back. The voices grew louder, now deafening, as if they were coming from all directions. He couldn't see them, but he commonly in all directions could feel them. The presence of the darkness was everywhere, closing in from all sides. The trees around him seemed to stretch and warp, their branches like hands reaching for him, their leaves whispering, taunting him. You belong to us! You belong to us! The voice said, louder now, impossibly deep and resonant. You can never escape. Jason's legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to his knees, his mind reeling. He had faced the darkness once, fought it off, but now it was more than just a justice. But now It was more than just shadows, it was everywhere. It was inside him. He closed his eyes, squeezing them shut as tight as he could, but the images didn't stop. The twisted face of Sarah, her hollow eyes staring back at him, filled his mind. The darkness wasn't just in the house, it had followed him, taken root inside him, like a poison he couldn't escape. "Please," Jason gasped, his voice trembling. "Let me go." But the voice didn't answer. It didn't need to. It had already won. Jason opened his eyes, opened indeed to. Again. But this time the world around him was no longer the road he had been walking. It was the house, the cursed house, standing tall and menacing in front of him. Its dark windows like eyes staring down at him. The door creaked open, and Jason could feel the cold air rushing out, pulling him inside. "You're already here," the voice said, as though it were inside his own mind. "You never left." Jason tried to stand, but his body refused to move. He was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of the darkness that surrounded him. He could hear the whispers again, now clear and distinct. "This is where you belong." The door to the house opened wider, and Jason felt the pull of it, the force of the darkness, drawing him closer. He didn't want to go. He couldn't go back inside. But it was too late. He had already stepped into the house once, and it had claimed him. Now, there was no escape. With a final, desperate cry, Jason fell to the ground, his body scrunchily gasped, trembling uncontrollably as the darkness enveloped him once more. Jason's body trembled on the cold, damp ground as the darkness wrapped around him, seeping into every corner of his mind. It felt like an eternity before the world began to shift again, the suffocating weight of it lifting slightly. The air, once thick with oppressive shadows, now felt almost still, like the calm before the storm. He slowly opened his eyes, squinting against the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the walls. The house was the same, yet somehow different, like it was alive, pulsing with an energy of its own. The darkness still clung to him, but it was quieter now, as though it were biding its time, watching him from the corners of his vision. Jason could feel the pressure building in the air, the whispers just beyond the edge of his hearing, like they were waiting for him to make the next move. He forced himself to his feet, his legs shaking from exhaustion, his body bruised and battered from the emotional and physical toll the darkness had taken on him. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let the house win. He had faced it before, and he would face it again. But this time, he needed answers. He needed to understand what had been happening. Why this place? Why him? Jason's breath caught as he stood there, frozen, his gaze locked on the hallway ahead. It was dark, just as it had been before. But now, the air was charged, thick with an unsettling energy. The house seemed to pulse with each breath he took, as if it were alive, watching him. Suddenly, the door at the end of the hallway creaked open, slowly, almost as if it had been waiting for him. The hinges groaned as the door revealed a narrow, dimly lit room. Jason felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He didn't want to go in there. He didn't want to step back into the heart of whatever evil had claimed this house. But the pull was too strong. He couldn't fight it anymore. He stepped forward, his feet hesitant, as though they were being guided by some unseen force. The room ahead felt familiar. It was almost like a vision from the past, but twisted, distorted. He could feel it in his chest, the weight of it, the suffocating pressure that seemed to surround him. As he crossed the threshold into the room, the air grew colder. His breath came out in visible clouds, and the whispers returned, this time louder than ever before. He could hear them clearly now, and they were all saying the same thing. "You're here. Jason's skin crawled as he looked around the room. It was a small, cramped space, filled with old furniture draped in it, sheets. The walls were lined with photographs, their faces barely visible beneath layers of dust and grime. There were no windows, no way to escape. His eyes flickered to the center of the room, where a large, ornate mirror stood. Covered in a thick layer of dust, but the glass was still clear, reflecting the dim light around it. Jason couldn't take his eyes off it. There was something about the mirror familiar. Something wrong. The whispers grew louder, echoing in his ears, filling his head. They were no longer just voices. They were sensations, feelings, memories all coming at once. His vision blurred as he staggered toward the mirror, his heart racing. The glass shimmered as he approached, could see himself in it, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, reflected in the mirror, was the figure of Sarah. Her twisted form stood just behind him, her eyes glowing with that same eerie, hollow light. Her face was stretched into a grotesque, contorted smile, and Jason could feel her presence like a weight on his chest. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew she was there. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, standing in the darkness of the mirror, were more twisted, nightmarish forms, all wearing the same hollow smile, all with eyes that glowed with that same unnatural light. Jason's breath hitched in his throat. The room was no longer just a room. The mirror had opened a doorway, and the figures were stepping through. "No," he whispered, backing away from the mirror. But it was too late. The figures in the mirror began to move. They stepped toward him, their movements jerky, unnatural, like marionettes with their strings pulled too tight. Their eyes locked onto him, and the air around him grew colder, the shadows stretching out toward him, hungry and waiting. Jason turned and ran, his feet pounding against the floor, his heart hammering in his chest. But the door he had come through slammed shut, trapping him in the room with the figures. He was cornered, the mirror reflecting their twisted forms, the darkness growing thicker, more suffocating. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to be coming from every direction. "You can't escape," they whispered, over and over again. "You belong to us." Jason stumbled backward, his mind racing for a solution, but there was no way out. The darkness had surrounded him completely. The figures in the mirror were stepping forward, their hands reaching out, their faces distorted with grotesque smiles. He had to fight. He had to do something. Without thinking, Jason reached for the flashlight in his pocket. His hand was shaking as he pulled it out, but he didn't hesitate. He turned it on and pointed it directly at the mirror. The beam of light cut through the darkness, shining directly at the figures. For a moment, nothing happened. The darkness seemed to pause, the figures frozen in place. But then, as if they were being drawn to the light, the figures began to twitch, their movements growing faster, more erratic. The light from the flashlight flickered, struggling against the growing darkness. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed the light toward them. The figures in the mirror screamed, their faces twisting in agony, their eyes flashing with rage. The shadows in the room grew deeper, the walls closing in around him. He couldn't let them get to him. He couldn't let them drag him back into the abyss. With a final desperate cry, Jason pushed the flashlight forward, the beam brighter than ever. The figures recoiled, their vigors recoiled, their twisted forms flickering in and out of existence. And for a moment, the darkness seemed to waver. But the moment was brief. The shadows surged forward, crashing against the light like a wave. Jason's body was pulled toward the mirror, as if it had become a vortex, pulling him back into it. And just as he thought he was going to be swallowed whole by the darkness, the light flickered once more, and Jason felt the ground beneath him give way. Jason felt his body being pulled, not just felt his body being pulled, not just physically, but in every fiber of his being, as though the very air around him had turned to liquid, dragging him down into some deep, unknown abyss. The light from the flashlight flickered once more, a last gasp of defiance against the overwhelming darkness that surrounded him. He couldn't tell which way was up, or if he was even standing at all. The coldness of the shadows seeped through his skin, gnawing at his bones, and it was then that he realized with a sickening clarity, this was it. He was lost. The flashlight's light was gone now, swallowed by the inky blackness, and the floor beneath him was nothing but a void. His head spun, his vision blurred, and all around him, the whispers were louder, their words twisting and echoing, overlapping each other. A chorus of broken voices. You cannot escape. You are ours. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow and quick. He fought against the sensation of being swallowed, drawn into the depths of this nightmare. He couldn't hear anything else except for the voice of Sarah, the thing that had once been Sarah murmuring in his mind, twisting his thoughts. You've always belonged here. Don't you understand? But no, he would not give in, not this time. He had survived too much, fought too hard. He was not going to let the house take him, he gasped, his feet finding solid ground once again, though it felt unnatural, like walking on unstable sand. His mind reeled as he stood in the pitch-black void, trying to gather his bearings, but the shadows around him shifted, stretching toward him with unnatural speed. The air felt so thick, so heavy that he could barely draw a breath. You can never leave. Jason didn't look back. He couldn't. The words rang in his head, like a distorted echo of something familiar. No matter how many times they spoke it, no matter how many times he heard it, he refused to accept it. I will leave, he muttered, his voice strained but full of defiance. The darkness pressed in around him like a vice, but as he clenched his fists, a sudden thought struck him, a flash of something buried deep in his memory. A moment in the house, something that felt like he had seen something before. A symbol, a mark on the wall. Something from the house. A sigil, the sigil. The sigil. The thought brought a jolt of recognition. It was a way to break the curse. The runes etched into the wall, faded with time, but unmistakable. A symbol of protection. A ward, a way to banish the darkness if he could just remember how to use it. Jason's eyes snapped open as the realization hit him. He was in the depths now, yes, but this was not the end. He could feel the mark, the symbol in his mind, as if it were calling to him, urging him to draw it, to use it. The whispers around him grew louder, like 100 voices screaming at him, trying to drown him out. You cannot fight it. They clawed at his mind, pushing him down. This is where you belong. No, Jason whispered, his hands trembling as he reached out, his fingers trying to find something solid in the void. His heart thundered in his chest, and his breathing became shallow with desperation. But then, his fingers brushed against something rough, textured surface, the wall. He pressed his hands against it, feeling the contours of something carved into the stone. It was cold, ancient. He could almost hear the heartbeat of the house in the walls, pulsing beneath his palms, alive. Jason closed his eyes, his breath quickening, as he searched for the sigil, the symbol he had seen. And there it was. The faintest impression of a circle, surrounded by intricate lines like a web, a net, a trap, and at its center, a simple, bold mark. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he realized what it was. The sigil wasn't just a symbol. It was the key. The key. House had no power over him unless he allowed it. He had to reclaim his own will, his own mind, and forced the darkness back. His body was still trembling, but as his fingers traced the pattern, a surge of energy shot through him. He could feel it raw power of the house pushing against him, fighting him. But Jason held firm. The sigil was his only weapon. It was his light in the darkness. "No," Jason whispered again, this time more firmly. "I won't let you take me." With all his remaining strength, he began to trace the sigil in the air in front of him, his fingers moving through the darkness as though they were cutting through the very fabric of reality. The air around him began to hum, vibrating with energy as if the house itself was recoiling from the force he was unleashing. The shadows screamed louder, pushing in from all directions. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the room seemed to shift, bending, distorting. Jason's vision blurred. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The sigil was glowing now, a faint pulsing light forming around his hand as he finished tracing the final lines. The house rumbled, the walls creaking as though the very foundation was cracking. He could feel it. The house was dying. The darkness was retreating, pulled back by the power of the sigil. Jason's heart raced as the shadows screamed one last time, their voices filled with rage and fear. The sigil glowed brighter, forcing the darkness back, pushing it into the corners, into the cracks where it had come from. And then, with a final deafening shriek, the darkness shattered, evaporating into the air like smoke. For a long moment, the silence was absolute. Jason stood there, his hands still glowing with the faint light of the sigil, his breath heavy and labored. He felt drained, as though every ounce of his strength had been spent in the battle against the darkness. But it was gone. The house was no longer alive. It had no more power. It was just a broken shell, a memory of the nightmare that had consumed him. The figures, the whispers, the presence, it was all gone. Jason slowly lowered his hand, his fingers still trembling. He felt trembling, exhausted, like he had just fought a war. But as he took one last look around the empty, silent room, he realized that he was free. He had escaped. Jason stood in the silence of the room, his mind still reeling from the battle he had just fought. The darkness that had consumed this place, that had consumed him, was gone, but the weight of it still lingered in his chest. He had faced it. He had stood against the cursed house, the shadows that had taken so many, and he had won, for now. But as the minutes ticked by, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't truly over. The house was silent now, but its presence, the faintest trace of it, still clung to him. It was like the memory of a nightmare that refused to leave, like something that would always be with him, hiding just beneath the surface. He glanced around the room, seeing it now for what it truly was. The walls, once dark and oppressive, were now just walls. The floor was cracked, the furniture old and weathered. The room looked like a place long abandoned, like something frozen in time. And yet, Jason couldn't help but feel as if the house itself were watching him, waiting. A shiver ran down his spine, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't stay here, not anymore. Jason turned and walked toward the door. As his hand brushed against the cold metal handle, he hesitated. The darkness might be gone, but the feeling of it still lingered. Pulling at him still lingered, like a thread he couldn't quite break. His mind raced with questions. How had it all started? What was this curse? What had happened to Sarah? The door creaked open, and Jason stepped into the hallway. The house, though still eerie, felt less alive. The oppressive weight had lifted, but something about it still didn't sit right with him. The silence in the air was unnerving. The silence in the air was unnerving, and the house seemed so much more vacant now. He walked down the hallway, passing the rooms that had once been the scene of his worst nightmares. But now, they were just empty spaces. The walls were bare, the floors covered in dust. House no longer seemed alive with the dark force that had controlled it. It was just an old house, forgotten, abandoned, and for the first time, free of the curse that had haunted it for so long. Jason reached the front door, his heart pounding as he touched the cold, worn wood. He paused, feeling the weight of the past pressing against him. He didn't know what he was expecting, but he knew that stepping outside meant leaving this behind. The house, the curse, the nightmare. It would all be behind him, locked away in the past. But something stopped him. The door. It was still ajar, as if inviting him to leave. He pushed it open, stepping into the cool night air. The breeze carried the smell of the forest, fresh and clean, and the stars above were bright and clear. Jason blinked against the light of the moon, his body still trembling from the ordeal. But as he stepped away from the house, he felt a sense of relief washing over him. He was free, or was. He was free, or was he? Just as Jason took another step forward, a sharp sound cut through the silence. It was a soft creak, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Jason froze, his heart skipping a beat as the sound seemed to echo in the night. He looked back over his shoulder toward the house, but the door was still open, no sign of movement, no sign of anything that could explain the sound. But then, another creak, louder this time, like the floorboards inside the house groaning under someone's Jason's blood ran cold. He took a hesitant step back toward the door, his breath catching in his throat. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure of Sarah, version of her that had haunted him. No, this was different. This Sarah was real. Or at least she looked it. She was standing in the doorway, her back to him, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She didn't move, didn't turn to face him, but Jason could feel her presence, could feel the coldness of her gaze on the back of his neck. No, this can't be happening again. Jason's breath came in, ragged gasps as his heart thudded in his chest. He should have kept walking. Should have gotten as far away from this place as possible. But some pull, kept him rooted to the spot, as if the house itself was drawing him back in. "Sarah," Jason whispered, his voice trembling. She didn't respond, but he could hear her breathing now, slow and steady, the same rhythmic breath that had filled the silence before. "Sarah," he shouted, louder this time, but there was still no response. He took another step forward, unsure of what to expect, but desperate to understand. Then, slowly, as if in a trance, Sarah turned around. Her face was pale, too pale. Her face was pale, too pale. Her eyes were wide, but lifeless, hollow. They glowed with an unnatural light, the same light that had filled her eyes before. Her mouth stretched into a smile, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was twisted, distorted, as though she was being forced to smile against her will. "You thought you were free." Jason took a step back, but his feet felt heavy, rooted to the spot. He wanted to run, to leave, but something inside him told him that running would only make it worse. He could hen, it all go friend, you know that Sean. I would only make it worse. Hear the voice now, louder, clearer. "You belong to us. You always will." "No," Jason said, his voice shaking with terror. "No, I am free. I'm not part of this anymore." Sarah's smile only widened, her eyes burning with that same dark light. "You never left," she whispered, her voice no longer hers but something darker, something older. "You were always part of it, and now we are all here, together." Jason's pulse thundered in his ears as the darkness seemed to rise up around him once more, sweeping through the air like smoke. The shadows came alive again, stretching toward him, surrounding him, pressing in on him. He couldn't escape. He wasn't free. And before he could react, again, pulling him into its depths, as Sarah's twisted smile echoed in his ears, Jason's body tensed as the darkness wrapped around him once again. the cold tendrils of it seeping into his skin, crawling through his veins. It felt like the world was slipping away, and no matter how hard he fought, the pull was too strong. The shadows engulfed him, pulling him deeper into the abyss, and the figure of Sarah, twisted and otherworldly, stood at the center of it all. Her eyes, his eyes, and at the center of it all, glowing with an unnatural light. The whispers returned, louder than ever, echoing in his mind, seeping into his thoughts like poison. You can never escape. You belong to us. Forever. Jason's chest tightened as he struggled against the overwhelming presence of the darkness. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat louder than the last. But the more he resisted, the more the shadows pressed in on him, suffocating him with their weight. He couldn't breathe, move. No, he thought, his mind screaming in defiance. I won't let this consume me again. I won't let it take me. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jason focused on the light inside him, the flicker of hope, the defiance that had once helped him fight back. He reached deep within, calling on that inner strength, that spark of power that had once pushed the darkness away. And suddenly, the darkness faltered. Jason could feel it. He could feel the pressure around him, loosening, the shadows pulling back just a little. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, willing himself to stand tall, to break free from the oppressive weight that had once consumed him. With a final, desperate cry, Jason thrust his hands forward, as if reaching for something just out of his grasp. The air around him crackled with energy, and for a moment, the darkness recoiled. The figure of Sarah was no longer smiling. Her eyes, glowing with that unnatural light, flickered as if struggling to hold her form together. The darkness around her seemed to writhe and bend, as if it were fighting to keep control of the situation. Jason stepped forward, his body still trembling, but his resolve stronger than ever. He had been through too much, fought too long, to let this force claim him. He was not some puppet, not some lost soul to be dragged into the abyss. I'm not yours, he whispered through clenched teeth. I will not be your prisoner. The room around him seemed to shift, like the house itself was alive, fighting against him, but Jason's voice was a steady force, cutting through the darkness. I will break you, he whispered, his words filled with a power he had never known he possessed, and for the first time, the darkness paused. The shadows wavered, the figure of Sarah flickered, her form unstable. The whispers grew frantic, overlapping, as though they couldn't decide what to say, what to do. Jason could feel it now. The house, the evil that had consumed it, was weakening. He could feel its hold slipping, its grip loosening, and for the first time, he could see a sliver of light through the endless black. No. The voice in his mind hissed, but Jason's mind hissed. But Jason's will was stronger. You cannot defeat us. You are part of this. But the more the voice fought, the more Jason pushed back. He could feel the darkness crumbling, its power fading. He wasn't part of this. He never had been. The house had tried to break him, but it had failed. Jason's hand shot forward, and he touched the air, pulling the light from within him into a powerful beam that shattered the darkness around him. The room erupted in a flash of blinding light, and for a moment, everything was silent. When the light faded, Jason opened his eyes. He was standing alone in a small, empty room. The house was gone. The shadows were gone. The oppressive darkness that had once filled this place was nothing but a distant memory now. Jason's heart still raced, but the overwhelming weight that had pressed on him for so long was gone. The air was fresh, clean, and still. He could breathe again. He glanced around the room. It was small, a simple room. It was small, a simple room, with peeling walls and a single window, but there was nothing else. No more figures, no more whispers. It was as if the house had never existed. Jason stood there for a moment, his mind spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it all been real? Had he really faced the house, the darkness, Sarah? Or had it been some twisted dream, some hallucination brought on by the terror of what he had gone through? But no, this was real. It was over. For now, he took a deep breath and stepped forward, his legs shaky but determined. He didn't know where he was, but it didn't matter. He had faced the darkness. He had survived. And somehow that was enough. As he walked toward the door, he glanced back at the empty room one last time. The house, the curse, the darkness, it was all behind him now. But as he stepped out into the night, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something still watched him. Something that would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. Jason wasn't sure if he would ever truly escape it. But for tonight, he was free. Jason stepped into the quiet night, the air cool against his skin as he made his way down the now familiar, twisted road. The house was gone, but the memories of it, of the darkness that had haunted him, lingered in his mind like a haunting melody that wouldn't fade. He kept walking, his steps steady but heavy, as if the weight of everything he had just experienced was still pressing down on him. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches whispered in the wind, swaying like fingers reaching out to grab him. But Jason refused to look back. He couldn't afford to. He had come too far, fought too hard to let the darkness consume him again. But as he walked, that feeling, the one he had hoped would disappear, came back again. The sensation of being watched, the chill creeping along the back of his neck. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the house standing there, just beyond the trees, its windows glowing with that same malevolent light. But there was nothing. Still, the feeling persisted. Jason's heart beat faster. But he pressed on, determined to leave this place behind him. He couldn't look back. He couldn't let himself fall into the trap again. But just fall into the trap again. But just as he thought he was getting away, just as he thought he had truly left the darkness behind, he heard it. A whisper, soft at first, but unmistakable. "You can't run from us." The voice was familiar. It sounded like Sarah, like that twisted, mocking version of her that had haunted him. The voice that had followed him since he first set foot in the house. The voice that had taunted him, tormented him, made him question his very sanity. Jason froze in his tracks. His breath caught in his throat, the whisper ringing in his ears. He tried to shake it off, tried to dismiss it as some trick of his mind, but it felt too real. The darkness was still here, still following him, even though he had left the house behind. Even though he had left the house behind, belonged to us. Forever. Jason turned around, his heart pounding in his chest. But again, there was nothing. The road was empty, the trees silent. His breath came in ragged gasps as he strained his eyes, searching the shadows for any sign of a movement. But nothing. It was just his mind playing tricks on him. He had been through so much. The darkness had left its mark on him, and now it was trying to drag him back. But he wouldn't let it. Jason turned and began walking again. But he wouldn't let it. Faster this time. He had to get away. He had to break free. He couldn't let it win. But the whispers came again, louder this time, closer, as if they were right beside him. "You will never be free, Jason." Panic flooded his chest as he picked up his pace, his legs moving faster, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The voice, the presence, it was closing in on him. He could feel it like a weight on his back, like invisible hands reaching out to drag him back into the dark abyss. Suddenly, the air around him shifted. The trees, the road, everything around him seemed to blur, to twist, as if reality itself was warping. Jason stumbled, his feet slipping on the uneven ground. He felt dizzy, disoriented. He felt dizzy, disoriented, like the world was spinning out of control. He stopped in his tracks, gripping the ground beneath him as the sensation of being pulled in every direction intensified. His eyes darted around, but all he saw was the darkness. The shadows, that darkness. The shadows, that darkness, stretched and shifted like living things. The whispers were louder now, too loud, overwhelming his senses. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't think. All he could hear were the voices, repeating the same words over and over again. "You belong to us. You can never escape." Jason gasped for air, his body trembling, his chest tight with fear. The darkness had returned. It had found him, no matter how far he'd run. The house might have been gone, but the curse, the evil, it had followed him. He wasn't free. He would never be free. A figure appeared before him, stepping out from the shadows. It was Sarah. No, not Sarah. The twisted version of her, her eyes glowing with that same hollow light. Her mouth stretched into hollow light. Her mouth stretched into an eerie grin. "You are ours now," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. "There is no escape. You are part of us." Jason's breath hitched, his pulse quickening as he took a step back. This wasn't real. He couldn't let it be real. He had to fight. He had to push back. But the figure stepped closer, and the ground beneath him shifted again, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The whispers grew louder. The figure's form flickering, shifting with each passing second. Jason reached for the flashlight in his pocket, his hands shaking as he pulled it out. The light flickered, weak and dim, but it was all he had. He aimed it at the figure, and for a moment it seemed to recoil, the shadows around it flickering and retreating, but the figure didn't vanish. It only grew stronger, its smile widening as it stepped closer, closer. Jason backed away, but the ground beneath him seemed to give way, and suddenly he was falling, the light in his way. A light in his falling hand flickered and went out, and he plunged into the dark. The whispers were all around him, the voices calling his name, drowning him in their endless chorus. Jason tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the dark. He couldn't move, he couldn't escape. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the darkness stopped. Jason opened his eyes, gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. His vision was blurry, his surroundings unfamiliar. He was no longer unfamiliar. He was no longer on the road, no longer in the forest. He was in a room, a small, dimly lit room with a single, flickering candle casting long shadows on the walls. He stood up quickly, panic rising in his chest as he looked around. The room was bare, save for the candle and a small old wooden chair in the corner. The walls were cracked, the air musty, but it felt safer. But he knew better. The darkness was still with him, and it would never let him go. Jason's breath came in quick, ragged, ragged gasps as he surveyed the room, his body shaking from the aftermath of the nightmare he had just endured. The flickering candle in the corner cast shadows that seemed to dance and shift. But there was no escaping the feeling that someone was watching him. The silence felt like a weight on his chest, pressing in on him, and he couldn't shake the sensation that the darkness was still close, lurking, just beyond his reach. He stumbled forward, his legs weak beneath him. The room, all cramped, the walls cracked and peeling, and the air thick with dust and decay. He could feel the oppressive presence in the room. even though there was nothing in it except for the chair and a faint glow of the candle. Jason approached the candle, reaching out a trembling hand toward its faint light. It felt like a lifeline, like something that might push the shadows back, at least for a moment. But as his fingers brushed the candle's base, the room shifted again, the walls warped, the shadows growing longer, the air growing colder. The soft whispering returned, so faint that it was barely audible, but Jason could hear it in his bones. "You cannot escape. You belong to us." His heart skipped a beat, panic seizing him once again. He spun around, looking for the source of the voice, but there was no one. The room was empty. The shadows stretched and curled, twisting like dark serpents. Jason clutched the candle harder, his eyes wide, wide, with fear. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "No, I won't let you win. I won't let you take me." He backed away, his eyes scanning the room desperately. He had to get out of here. He couldn't stay. He had escaped the house. Escaped the house. Escaped the house. The darkness. But now it felt like it was closing in on him once again. The whispers grew louder, and Jason's mind began to unravel. His grip on the candle tightened, his fingers numb with the force of it. He could feel the presence, the dark force closing in around him. It was too much. The weight of it, the pressure, the suffocating feeling of being watched. It was all too much. The door to the room, which he hadn't noticed before, creaked open. Jason's pulse raced as he looked open. Jason's pulse raced as he looked at the dark doorway. Something in his gut told him that whatever was on the other side, whatever waited in that darkness, was not something he could face. Not again. "You belong here." Jason's legs moved on their own as the words rang in his ears. The door was open, beckoning him, pulling him closer with an invisible force. He could feel the darkness at his back, closing in, suffocating him. But the door, it called to him. He knew he had to face whatever was on the other side. He knew he had to face whatever was on the other side. Had to know if he could break free. With a deep breath, he stepped toward the door, his legs weak beneath him, his every instinct screaming for him to turn around, to run. But he couldn't. Not anymore. Not after everything. Jason stepped into the doorway. The air changed immediately. It was colder, sharper, like stepping into a different world. His breath came out in visible clouds, the chill biting into his skin. The door slammed shut behind him, and Jason's heart skipped as the shadows around him deepened, thickening like a tangible substance. The room beyond was vast, like an endless cavern, dark and oppressive. The walls stretched upwards, higher than he could see, and the space seemed to go on forever. Higher than he could see, and the space seemed to go on. Darkness swallowing everything. The only sound was the steady echo of his footsteps against the cold, hard floor. In the distance, a faint, dim light glimmered. Jason moved toward it, his heart pounding with fear and anticipation. The further, pounding with fear and anticipation, he walked, the colder it became, the weight of the darkness pressing in on him, clawing at his senses. He couldn't see where the light was coming from, but it seemed to beckon him forward, drawing him closer, like a flicker of hope in the endless black. But as he neared it, the light began to distort, flickering like a dying flame. Jason hesitated for a moment, unsure of what was happening, but something told him that he had to keep going. He had to reach it. When he finally reached the light, he stopped dead in his tracks. It wasn't a light at all. It was a mirror. The mirror was large, its edges ornate, covered in intricate carvings that Jason couldn't make sense. The glass was clear, but it was different. It didn't reflect the cavern around him. It didn't reflect anything at all. Instead, the mirror seemed to draw him in, pulling him closer to it with an unseen force. Jason's breath hitched as he stared into the mirror, He saw himself, his reflection, just as he had expected, but there was something wrong with it. His reflection was distorted, like a smudge, as though it didn't belong in this place. His eyes were wide, filled with fear, and his mouth moved, but no sound came out. It was as if his reflection was trying to speak, trying to warn him, but the words were trapped behind the glass. "No," Jason whispered, his voice hoarse. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold surface of the mirror. The moment his hand made contact, a jolt of cold shot through him, freezing him to the spot. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror changed. It wasn't him anymore. It was Sarah. Her twisted, empty eyes stared back at him. Her mouth stared back at him. Her mouth stretched into that horrific, unnatural smile. Her figure was distorted just like before, flickering in and out of focus, but now she was standing right in front of him, trapped inside the mirror, her hands pressed against the glass, as if it reaching for him. "You can't escape, Jason," Jason recoiled, his body freezing in terror. The room around him seemed to darken even more, the shadows stretching like tendrils toward the mirror. The glass began to crack, the fractures spreading like a spider's web, and Jason could hear the sounds of someone scratching on the other side, clawing to get out. "You are ours!" With a sudden, gut-wrenching scream, the mirror shattered, the glass exploded outward, and Jason was thrown back, his body slamming against the cold, hard ground. For a moment, everything was still, and then the darkness closed in around him. Jason gasped for air as he scrambled to his feet, the shards of glass from the mirror scattered around him, glinting in the dim light that now flickered erratically, like the pulse of a dying heartbeat. The darkness that had closed in around him after the mirror shattered felt heavier than ever, its oppressive weight suffocating him, like it was wrapping its fingers around his throat, trying to pull him back into the void. He looked around desperately, his mind racing. The room, once a cavern of emptiness, was now changing, warping before his eyes. The walls seemed to ripple, as if they were alive, breathing, closing in on him. The floor beneath him felt uneven, like it was shifting, moving beneath his feet. It was as if the house was alive again, pulling him deeper into its grasp. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat like a countdown. "I can't let it win," he thought, his breath shallow, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. "I won't be its victim again." But then he heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible at first, growing audible at first, growing louder with each passing second. "You belong to us." The voice was chilling, echoing in his mind. It wasn't Sarah's voice anymore. It was something worse, something darker, ancient, malevolent. Jason felt the cold fingers of fear wrap around in his heart as he turned in circles, searching for the source of the voice. He knew it wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, a force that had consumed this house, this town, this entire place, and now it was coming for him. The whispers grew, louder, more insistent. He couldn't escape them. They clawed at his mind, filling his thoughts with despair. "You can run. You are ours." Jason stumbled backward, his eyes wide with panic. He felt himself being pulled toward the center of the room, as if the very air around him was thick with the power of the dark force that had claimed this place. The shadows swirled around him, closing in, their cold tendrils wrapping around his limbs, pulling him deeper into the darkness. He could feel them like icy fingers digging into his flesh, squeezing the breath out of him. But even as the darkness closed in, Jason fought. He wasn't going to give in to it. He had fought too hard, too long, to let this house consume him. Again, he reached into the pit of his soul, searching for that spark of light, that shred of hope he had found before. "I am not yours." The words escaped his lips in a hoarse whisper, but they felt like a weapon. He didn't need to scream, didn't need to shout, he just needed to remember that the darkness had no power over him unless he allowed it. He wasn't some lost soul. He wasn't a puppet for the shadows. The darkness faltered. Jason felt it. The pressure around him eased. The suffocating grip of the shadows loosening for just a moment. That moment was all he needed. With every ounce of willpower he could summon, Jason surged forward, pushing the darkness back. The shadows screamed in frustration. The voices screamed in frustration, growing louder. But Jason didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He focused on the light inside him, the light that had burned through the darkness before. It was still there, deep within him, waiting to be unleashed. He reached forward with his hands, his fingers glowing with an ethereal light that seemed to emanate from his very soul. The darkness recoiled, the shadows writhing like snakes trying to escape the light. The room shifted again, the walls bending and warping, but Jason held steady. He had to push forward. He had to fight. With a roar of defiance, he thrust his hands out, sending a wave of light crashing through the room. The shadows screamed, the room shaking violently as the light tore through them, cutting the darkness like a blade. For a moment, everything was still. The whispers stopped. The shadows faded. The room, once suffocating and alive with the presence of the curse, was now silent. Jason's breath came in quick bursts as he stood in the center of the room, the light from his hands still glowing faintly, casting long shadows on the walls. It was over. For now. But Jason knew better than to think it was truly gone. The darkness had retreated, but it was always there, waiting, watching. He could feel its pull deep in his bones, and he knew that as long as he was in this town, in this cursed house, it would never truly let him go. But he had won. For now, at least. And that was enough. Jason took one final steadying breath as he glanced around the room, taking in the eerie stillness. The shadows had been pushed back. The house had been quieted. For the first time in what felt like forever. He could breathe without the weight of forever. The darkness pressing down on him. He wasn't free, not completely. But he had fought the curse, and for now, he had won, and that would have to be enough. Jason stood there, panting, his chest heaving as the last remnants of the darkness faded from the room. The house, though still old and eerie, seemed quieter now, as if the oppressive force that had held it captive had been forced to retreat. The air around him felt lighter, less suffocating, but Jason knew better than to think this was the end. The darkness had been strong before, and it would be strong again, but for now, he was alive. He had survived, and that to count for something, as he slowly turned to leave the room. His mind racing with everything he had just experienced. Jason noticed something strange. The door that had been closed just moments ago, the one he had entered through, was now wide open. He could see the hallway beyond, empty and still. The shadows in the corners of the room seeming to stretch longer than they should. Jason hesitated. The open door was like an invitation, a way out. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. It was as if the house was offering him an escape, but Jason knew better. There was no easy way out of this. He had seen what this house could do, and the darkness was not something you could simply outrun. But he didn't have a choice. The whispers had stopped for now, but there was still an unsettling feeling, a sense that something was waiting for him just beyond the door. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the pull of the unknown. But he couldn't stay here. Not anymore. He walked toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. He had to leave, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. Jason knew that whatever awaited him beyond the door was better than what he had already faced. The hallway stretched out before him, the walls lined with faded wallpaper, the air thick with dust and decay. The silence was almost deafening, but Jason could hear the faintest echo of his own footsteps, each one sounding too loud, too sharp in the stillness. He walked slowly, cautiously, as if every step might trigger something in the house, as though the floorboards themselves might give way and swallow him whole. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a soft, almost imperceptible creak. Jason froze, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes darted around, scanning the hallway, but there was nothing there. No figures, no shadows, just the old wooden floor and the dim light of the hallway. He exhaled, trying to steady his nerves. It was just the house settling. Nothing more. But then, another while. But then, another sound closer this time. A low, guttural growl. Jason's blood ran cold as he slowly turned his head, his breath catching in his throat. He couldn't see anything in the shadows, but the growl was unmistakable. It came from somewhere in the darkness from the corners of the hallway, as if something was lurking there, waiting. Jason backed away slowly, his legs shaking beneath him. His instincts screamed at him to turn and run, to escape, but the growl came again, louder this time. The darkness seemed to move with it, creeping along the walls, slithering toward him. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible as he took another step back. "Not again." But there was no escaping it. The growl was louder now, closer, and Jason could feel it deep in his chest, vibrating through the air. The shadows shifted, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something, a figure, dark and distorted, moving in the corner of his vision. His heart raced, his pulse quickening, but he forced himself to look away. He couldn't let the fear take hold again, but it was impossible. The growl came again, followed by a sound that made Jason's skin crawl, a slow, scraping noise, like nails dragging noise across stone. He whipped his head around, searching for the source, but the hallway was empty. There was nothing there, except the eyes. He saw them in the darkness, glowing faintly, like embers in the night. 2 eyes, staring at him from the end of the hallway. They weren't human. They were wrong, deep, glowing pits of malice watching him, waiting for him to make his move. Jason's breath hitched in his throat as the growl deepened, the air around him thickening. Shadows stretched toward him, curling around his feet, trying to pull him down. The figure at the end of the hall moved just slightly, a shape in the dark. He could see it now, long, elongated limbs, twisted and inhuman, crawling toward him like a spider, its eyes never leaving his. "Please," Jason whispered, his voice trembling. "No, not again." The figure stopped, its eyes burning into his soul, its shape almost too monstrous to comprehend. Its form flickered in the darkness, as though it couldn't quite hold itself together, like something caught between this world and the next. The growl came again, louder this time, and Jason's legs gave way beneath him. He fell to the floor, the cold, hard surface biting into his palms as he scrambled backward, his eyes still fixed on the creature. The shadows reached out, pulling at him, dragging him toward the thing that waited. "You will never escape." The voice was not a whisper this time. It was a growl, deep and powerful, reverberating through the walls. The creature in the darkness took another step forward, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. Jason could feel his heart racing, his body paralyzed with fear. His mind screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to move. He had to get out. He had to fight, with every ounce of strength he had left. Jason pushed himself off the floor, his body shaking as he stumbled to his feet. He had faced the darkness before. He had faced the darkness before, fought it back before, and he would do it again. He wouldn't let this thing, this nightmare, win. Jason ran. He didn't know where he was going, but his feet carried him forward, his legs moving on their own as the growl echoed behind him. "They fell," echoed behind him. Hallway stretched on forever, the darkness closing in. But Jason couldn't stop. He couldn't look back. He just had to run. And then he saw it. The door, the exit. He threw himself toward it, his heart pounding, his hands reaching for the other's handle. The growl was closer now, too close. He could feel the thing's breath on his neck, could feel its presence just behind him. But with one final desperate pull, Jason wrenched the door open and stepped out into the light. Jason wrenched the door open and stepped out into the light, stumbled out into the light, gasping for air, his body still trembling from the terror that had gripped him only moments ago. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening thud, but the darkness, the growling, the sinister presence that had haunted him, it was gone. For now, he stood there in the pale light of the moon, his breath still shaky, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was cold, but it was different from the suffocating atmosphere inside the house. There was a freshness to it, a stillness that was oddly comforting. But even as he stood there, trying to steady his nerves, something told him that the worst wasn't over. He wasn't free yet. Jason's eyes darted around, scanning the surrounding sheer landscape. The forest stretched out before him, its trees looming in the distance like silent sentinels. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. His mind raced. The images of the house, the twisted figure in the hallway, still fresh in his memory. He knew he couldn't stay here. The darkness was still close, still watching. It had followed him, and now it was waiting for him to slip up. Jason's legs felt weak, but he pushed forward, his feet moving on their own as he made his way through the woods. His mind kept drifting back to the house, to the figure in the hallway, to the whispers that had haunted him since the beginning. But he couldn't let himself be consumed by fear. He had to keep moving. He had to find a way to stop this once and for all. The trees seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing longer with each step. The wind rustled the leaves above, and the sound was like a low, mournful whisper, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that something was watching him from the darkness, just beyond the reach of his sight. Suddenly, a sound broke the street by. Silence, footsteps, faint at first, but growing louder. Jason froze, his heart skipping a beat. The footsteps were coming from behind him, slow and steady, just out of view. He spun around, but there was no one there. Nothing but the empty trees and the moonlight filtering through the leaves. The footsteps continued, closer now, as if whatever was following him was drawing near. Jason's breath quickened, panic clawing at his throat. He knew he couldn't outrun whatever it was. But he couldn't stand still either. He had to keep moving. Without thinking, Jason broke into a sprint, his feet pounding against the forest floor as he dashed through the trees, his heart pounding in his chest. The footsteps followed, relentless, keeping pace with him no matter how fast he ran. His mind raced, desperate for an escape, but the path ahead seemed to stretch on forever. There was no end in sight. Then, as if in a cruel twist of fate, the forest opened up and showed and sawi. It yours shall be. Deemer are owens var. When they was. Trio croaked before him. Jason skidded to a stop, his eyes wide in disbelief. He was back at the house. The cursed house stood before him, dark and imposing, its windows glowing faintly in the distance. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he realized he had been drawn back to it, pulled back into the very place he had fought so hard to escape. The footsteps stopped behind him, and Jason slowly turned around, his body frozen in terror. There, standing just outside the tree line, was the figure, the same twisted form, its eyes glowing with that unnatural light. Sarah's form flickered in and out of existence, her smile stretched wide across her face. But it wasn't her anymore. It was something else, something darker, something far worse. The growl from earlier returned, low and menacing, vibrating through the air like a living thing. Jason could feel it deep in his bones, the cold dread washing over him, suffocating him. But he wasn't about to give in again. Not this time. I won't be your victim, Jason shouted, his voice hoarse but full of defiance. The figure did not move, but its smile widened, its eyes burning brighter. The darkness around it seemed to swell, creeping forward like a living shadow. Jason's pulse raced as he realized that it wasn't just the figure he had to face now, it was the house itself. He had to destroy it. He had to destroy it. He had to end this. With a fierce determination, Jason turned and ran toward the house, his body aching with the house, his body aching with the house. Exhaustion, but his resolve stronger than ever. He could feel the darkness closing in behind him, but he didn't dare look back. He had come too far to turn around now. The door loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. But this time, Jason didn't hesitate. He threw it open, the hinges creaking in protest, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. But Jason didn't stop. He moved through the house with a house. Purpose, heading straight for the center. The whispers were louder now, filling the air with a chorus of voices, all of them taunting him, trying to break him. But Jason kept going, ignoring them. He could feel the house fighting back, pushing against him, but he had no choice. He had to reach the heart of it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he arrived in the main room, the room where it all began. The fireplace crackled in the distance, casting strange shadows on the walls, and there, in the center of the room, was the source of it all, the sigil, the mark that had been carved into the floor, glowing faintly in the dim light. Jason knew what he had to do. He knelt down in front of the sigil, his hands down in front of the sigil, his hands shaking as he traced the lines of the symbol, just as he had done before. This time, though, he could feel the power of the energy that had been drawing him in, feeding off his fear. "This ends now," he whispered, his voice steady with one steady, final motion. He completed the sigil. The ground trembled beneath him, and the air crackled with energy as the sigil began to glow brighter, its light growing stronger until the entire room was bathed in its brilliance. The darkness screamed, its form writhing as if it was being torn apart. Jason stood, his body shaking, but he didn't look away. He couldn't. This was it, the final battle, and with a final blinding flash, the darkness collapsed. The house groaned. The walls groaned. The walls cracking and crumbling as the sigil's light consumed it. The shadows that had once lived within it evaporated into the air, leaving nothing but silence behind. Jason stood alone in the center of the room, the light fading as the house disintegrated around him. He had won. He had destroyed the darkness. But even as the house fell to pieces, Jason knew that the true battle had just begun. The darkness would always be out there, lurking, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. But for now, Jason was free. As the last echoes of the darkness faded away, the crumbling remnants of the house fell into silence. The once mighty presence that had consumed this place, that had twisted it into something alive, had been eradicated, at least for now. Jason stood in the center of what was left of the house, his body bruised and battered, but his spirit unbroken. The air felt heavier, cleaner, without the suffocating weight of the curse pressing down on him. But as the ruins of the house settled around him, so did the truth. This was over, but it wasn't truly finished. He could still feel it, deep in his bones, the knowledge that the darkness had not been vanquished for good. It would always exist, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too far into the night. Jason turned and walked away from the wreckage. He knew there was nothing more to be done here. The house had claimed its last victim, but it would never stop searching for others. As he passed through the remains of the house, now a shell of its former self, he couldn't help but wonder if he had really destroyed it, or if it had simply slumbered, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The sky above him was dark, the stars barely visible through the thick clouds that rolled in. The breeze carried the scent of rain, and Jason instinctively quickened his pace as he walked down the road, away from the remnants of his nightmare. He kept his head low, not looking back. The road stretched out before him, endless and silent. Jason didn't know where he was going. His body was weary, his mind still trying to process everything that had happened. He had faced something he couldn't fully understand, something that had threatened to consume him, and yet, here he was alive. The road stretched on, dark and quiet. And for a moment, Jason allowed himself to believe that he had finally escaped it. Survived. He had defeated the darkness, and perhaps, for the first time in what felt like forever, he was free. But as he walked, something nagged at the back of his mind. The whispers had faded, but he could still feel them, like an echo of Ethel, a memory that refused to be forgotten. He could still hear the voice of the house, Sarah's twisted, hollow tone, telling him that he would never be free. And he understood now, with a sickening clarity, that the house, the darkness, had never truly been about the house itself. It was about him. It had always been about him. He was a part of it, and no matter how far he ran, no matter how much he tried to escape, it would always be with him. Jason's footsteps slowed as he reached the end of the road, the wind picking up and whipping through the trees around him. He looked up at the sky, the clouds heavy with rain, and for the first time, he wondered if maybe there was no escaping the darkness after all. He had thought he had destroyed it, that he had broken free. But the truth was, the darkness was not something that could be destroyed. It was a part of him now, a part of his soul, a shadow that would always linger, waiting for the right moment to rise again. As the first raindrops began to fall, Jason stood there, feeling the cold against his skin. The storm was coming, and he had no choice but to face it. He had come so far, fought so hard, but there was still so much left to do. He had come so far, he couldn't run forever. With a deep, steadying breath, Jason took his first step forward, knowing that no matter where he went, the shadows would always follow, but he would not be afraid. He had faced the darkness, and he had survived. And he faced the darkness, and he had survived. It came back. If it tried to take him again, he would face it head on. This was not the end. This was just the beginning. The rain began to fall steadily, its cool droplets hitting the ground, each one a soft echo in the night. Jason stood a soft echo in the night. Jason stood there, in the middle of the road, the weight of everything he had endured pressing down on him. He could feel it in his bones, the weariness of the battle, the toll it had taken on his mind and body. Yet, as the rain washed over him, something else lingered, a quiet understanding. He wasn't free. He would never truly be free, but he was alive, and for now, that was enough. The house, the darkness, the curse, it was all behind him. The twisted creatures, the voices, the shadows, it was all a fading nightmare. For a brief moment, Jason allowed himself to breathe. The storm had come, and with it, a sense of finality. The night that had stretched on forever was beginning to fade, as if the storm was washing away the last traces of the evil that had gripped this place. The fog in his mind began to lift, and the shadows that had once seemed to crawl behind him grew distant, fading into the night. He could feel the pull to keep walking. He had nowhere to go, nothing left to do, but something within him knew that he couldn't stop now. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he couldn't look back. He couldn't afford to. Jason kept walking through the rain, the road ahead unclear, but it didn't matter. Each step felt like a weight lifting, as if he were shedding pieces of himself, pieces of the past. Every raindrop that hit his skin seemed to cleanse him, washing away the darkness that had once defined his every thought, every breath. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the stillness, soft but steady, a rhythmic reminder that he was still here, still moving forward. As he walked, the rain began to lighten, and the wind started to shift, carrying with it a sense of force. I don't know anymore, I derive going to the very sense of fear, calm that Jason hadn't felt in so long. The storm was passing, leaving behind a quiet peace, the world settling into a new rhythm. Jason slowed his pace as he approached the edge of a small clearing, the trees parting to reveal a wide expanse of open land. It was an unfamiliar landscape, but something about it felt right, like it was where he was meant to be. He stood at the edge of the clearing, the rain now only a light drizzle, the ground soft beneath his feet. He took a deep breath, the air fresh and clean, his gaze turned upward, toward the vast expanse of sky above, the clouds breaking apart to reveal patches of moonlight. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could see clearly. Jason looked down at Trevor. He could see clearly the ground for a moment, his hand clenched into a fist. The darkness might have followed him, might have even been a part of him, but it wasn't the only thing that defined him. There was light in him, too. He had survived. He had fought, and he had won. He had made it out. But the fight wasn't over. He knew that now. The house, the darkness, it wasn't just a place. It wasn't just something he could leave behind. It was within him, always would be, and he would carry that burden as long as he lived, but it didn't have to control him. He was still Jason. He was still alive, and for that, he could take solace. With one final, deep breath, Jason turned around, facing the vast wilderness that stretched before him. Facing the vast wilderness that stretched before him. The path ahead was uncertain. He didn't know what lay beyond the horizon, but he knew he had a choice. The past would always be a part of him, but it wouldn't define his future. The curse, the darkness, had taken so much from him, but it had not taken his will. He took his first step into the clearing, the road ahead open, wide, and filled with possibility. The night sky above him was vast, the stars twinkling faintly through the clouds. For the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of the world begin to lift, and so he walked not toward escape, not away from the darkness, but toward something new, something unknown. Jason wasn't sure what the future held, but as he moved forward, he knew one thing for certain: he would face whatever came next, and no matter what, he wouldn't be afraid anymore.